A quiet gas station in the middle of nowhere becomes the stage for an unassuming yet intense confrontation. A group of rowdy bikers, led by their cocky leader, underestimate a seemingly average customer in a dusty military jacket. The situation spirals into chaos, only to reveal unexpected depths of character and life lessons. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the arid landscape as Noah pulled his beat-up truck into the nearly deserted gas station. Dust trailed behind him, settling like a shroud over the cracked pavement. The faint hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the rhythmic ticking of the truck's cooling engine. It had been a long drive, and Noah was looking forward to a cold drink and a quiet moment to stretch his legs. The gas station, a relic of a bygone era, stood at the crossroads of two lonely highways. Its faded red and white paint peeled in the relentless heat, and a single neon sign flickered intermittently, barely illuminating the word, "Open." Noah stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. He adjusted his worn military jacket, a habit more than a necessity, and made his way toward the door. Inside, the gas station was a picture of rural simplicity. Rows of dusty snacks and drinks lined the shelves, and a solitary ceiling fan creaked as it spun lazily overhead. Behind the counter, Claire, the middle-aged attendant, greeted him with a nod. She was used to drifters like Noah. Quiet, no-nonsense types passing through on their way to anywhere but here. As Noah grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines shattered the stillness. He glanced out the window as a group of bikers roared into the parking lot, their presence instantly transforming the sleepy station into a stage for trouble. There were 6 of them, clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias that screamed rebellion. At their head was Kane, a burly man with a jagged scar running down his cheek. His swagger as he dismounted was unmistakable. He was a man used to getting his way. The bikers strutted into the station, filling the small space with their loud voices and laughter. Kane surveyed the room like a predator sizing up his prey, his eyes landing on Noah. For a moment, the two men locked gazes, and an unspoken challenge passed between them. "What do we have here?" "2 asked 2. You said, 'Show the full chapter.' ChatGPT said, 'ChatGPT.'" Chapter 1. The Gas Station Encounter. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the arid landscape as Noah pulled his beat-up truck into the nearly deserted gas station. Dust trailed behind him, settling like a shroud over the cracked pavement. The faint hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the rhythmic ticking of the truck's cooling engine. It had been a long drive, and Noah was looking forward to a cold drink and a quiet moment to stretch his legs. The gas station, a relic of a bygone era, stood at the crossroads of two lonely highways. Its faded red and white paint peeled in the relentless heat, and a single neon sign flickered intermittently, barely illuminating the word, "Open." Noah stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. He adjusted his worn military jacket, a habit more than a necessity, and made his way toward the door. Inside, the gas station was a picture of rural simplicity. Rows of dusty snacks and drinks lined the shelves, and a solitary ceiling fan creaked as it spun lazily overhead. Behind the counter, Claire, the middle-aged attendant, greeted him with a nod. She was used to drifters like Noah. Quiet, no-nonsense types passing through on their way to anywhere but here. As Noah grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines shattered the stillness. He glanced out the window as a group of bikers roared into the parking lot, their presence instantly transforming the sleepy station into a stage for trouble. There were 6 of them, clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias that screamed rebellion. At their head was Kane, a burly man with a jagged scar running down his cheek. His swagger as he dismounted was unmistakable. He was a man used to getting his way. The bikers strutted into the station, filling the small space with their loud voices and laughter. Kane surveyed the room like a predator sizing up his prey, his eyes landing on Noah. For a moment, the two men locked gazes. and an unspoken challenge passed between them. "Hey, soldier boy," Kane called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You lost or something?" Noah didn't rise to the bait. He returned his gaze to the water cooler, twisting the cap off his bottle with deliberate calm. "Just passing through," he said evenly, his voice steady but not inviting further conversation. Kane chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Passing through, huh? Doesn't look like you're in much of a hurry. Maybe you should stick around. My boys and I could use a little entertainment." The bikers laughed, their voices echoing through the cramped space. One of them, a wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, stepped closer to Noah, clearly itching for a reaction. Noah, however, remained composed, his posture relaxed but alert. Claire watched from behind the counter, her hands hovering near the phone. "I don't want any trouble," Noah said, his tone measured. "Just getting my water and heading out." "Trouble?" Kane said, feigning surprise. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly. Ain't that right, boys?" The group erupted in laughter again, their mocking tones grating on Noah's nerves. He took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to engage. Years of military discipline had taught him the value of restraint, even when provoked. As Noah moved toward the counter to pay, Kane blocked his path. The air grew heavy with tension, the other bikers forming a loose circle around them. "You know," Kane said, leaning in closer, "you've got that look, all stiff and serious like you think you're better than us." Noah met Kane's gaze, his eyes calm but unyielding. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said. "I just don't see the point in wasting time on nonsense." For a split second, the room fell silent. Then Kane's grin widened and he clapped his hands together. "Nonsense, huh? Well, maybe we should teach you to loosen up a bit. What do you say, boys?" The bikers cheered, closing in on Noah. Claire's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "You boys want a roughhouse, you do it outside. You're not wrecking my store." Kane glanced at Claire, his expression darkening, but he seemed to think better of pushing her too far. "Fine," he said, stepping back. "Outside it is. You coming, soldier boy? Or are you scared?" Noah sighed, finishing his water in one long gulp before crumpling the bottle and tossing it into the trash. "I told you, I don't want any trouble," he said. But his words fell on deaf ears as Kane and his gang filed out of the station, waiting for him by the pumps. Claire caught Noah's arm as he moved to follow. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "They're not worth it." Noah gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Stepping outside, he found the bikers leaning against their motorcycles, their postures oozing confidence. Kane cracked his knuckles, a smirk plastered across his face. "All right, soldier, let's see what you've got." Noah rolled his shoulders, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. He had no intention of escalating the conflict, but he wasn't about to let them walk all over him either. The stage was set, and the first move was his to make. The desert air was still as the tension between Noah and Kane thickened. The gang, their smug grins masking growing unease, circled around like predators stalking prey. Kane flexed his fingers, clearly confident in his ability to assert dominance. Noah, standing quietly at the center of the storm, exuded calm that was anything but weakness. "You sure you're not going to run, soldier boy?" Kane taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. The gang laughed on cue, the sound echoing through the empty lot. "Wouldn't want you to twist an ankle." Noah regarded him coolly, his posture relaxed. "I don't run," he said simply. That answer, delivered without bravado, seemed to unnerve Kane more than a shouted retort might have. He squared his shoulders, brushing the edge of his jacket aside to reveal the handle of a knife clipped to his belt. "Good," he said, smirking. "Let's see what you're made of." Noah's eyes flicked briefly to the knife and back to Kane's face. "No weapons," he said firmly. "Just fists, unless you're afraid you can't handle that." The gang collectively bristled at the implied challenge to their leader. Kane let out a short laugh, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "Afraid? Of you?" he said. He unhooked the knife from his belt and tossed it aside, the blade glinting as it landed with a clatter on the pavement. "All right, soldier, let's dance." The two men squared off, the gang shouting and jeering as they formed a loose ring around them. Kane made the first move, lunging forward with a wild swing aimed at Noah's head. Noah sidestepped easily, his footwork quick and deliberate. Kane stumbled but recovered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Is that all you've got?" Noah asked, his tone mild. The gang laughed, but this time it wasn't entirely at Noah's expense. Kane's jaw tightened as he charged again, this time throwing a series of punches. Noah deflected them with practiced ease, his movements fluid and controlled. He wasn't attacking, yet, but every calculated step and dodge made it clear that he was in complete control of the fight. Frustration began to show in Kane's movements. His attacks grew wilder, less precise, and Noah capitalized on the openings. A quick jab to Kane's ribs forced him back, doubling over slightly. The gang fell silent, their jeers replaced by murmurs of unease. "Breathe," Noah said, almost as if he were coaching Kane. "You're burning yourself out." Kane's head snapped up, his face twisted with anger. "Shut up," he roared, lunging again. This time, Noah caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it just enough to force Kane to his knees. A sharp intake of breath came from one of the gang members, the sound loud in the stillness. "Stop," Noah said, his voice firm. "This doesn't have to go any further." Kane struggled against Noah's grip, but the soldier's strength was unyielding. For a moment, it seemed as though Kane might listen. Then, with a burst of effort, he yanked his arm free and staggered to his feet. His eyes were wild now, desperation mingling with rage. "You think you're better than me?" Kane spat. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "I didn't walk in here," Noah interrupted, his tone calm but with a hard edge. "You brought this fight to me. I told you I didn't want it." Kane let out a snarl, charging one last time. Noah stepped to the side, hooking Kane's leg with his own and sending the larger man sprawling to the ground. Kane's fall knocked the wind out of him, and he lay there for a moment, gasping. Noah stepped back, giving him space to get up if he chose to. "Enough," Noah said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the gang completely. "Walk away." Kane pushed himself up on one elbow, glaring at Noah with pure hatred, but he didn't get up. His pride wouldn't let him admit defeat, but his body wouldn't let him continue the fight. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man named Max, stepped forward hesitantly. "Kane, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Kane barked, his voice cracking. He shoved himself to his feet, wobbling slightly. "This isn't over," he growled, pointing a finger at Noah. Noah didn't respond. He simply picked up his jacket and turned toward his truck. The gang parted to let him through, their earlier bravado replaced by wary silence. As Noah climbed into the cab and started the engine, Kane shouted after him. "You hear me, soldier boy? This isn't over." Noah didn't look back. The truck rolled out of the lot, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. In the rearview mirror, he saw the gang regrouping around their leader. Kane was shouting something, but Noah couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He knew men like Kane, and he knew this encounter wouldn't be the last. As the gas station faded into the distance, Noah allowed himself a moment of reflection. He hadn't asked for this fight, but in some ways it felt inevitable. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he tried to run from it. But even as he drove on, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just about him. The gang's dynamic, the tension he'd seen in the younger members, hinted at deeper cracks beneath their tough exterior. For now, though, he put it out of his mind. The road stretched ahead, and with it, the promise of a quieter destination, at least for a little while. Noah wasn't surprised to find the bikers waiting for him further down the highway. It had taken less than an hour of driving for them to regroup and tail him, their roaring engines loud enough to announce their presence long before he spotted them in his mirrors. The barren stretch of road offered few places to pull over, but Noah wasn't about to let them push him into a reckless chase. Instead, he slowed down, signaling his intention to stop. The bikers surrounded his truck as it rolled to a halt. Dust swirled around them, mingling with the fading light of the setting sun. Kane dismounted his bike with exaggerated bravado, his scowl deepening as he approached the driver's side door. The rest of the gang fanned out, their expressions ranging from smug to uncertain. "Didn't think you'd get away that easy, did you, soldier boy?" Kane sneered, slapping a hand against the truck's hood. "Time to finish what you started." Noah stayed seated for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. His calm demeanor seemed to rattle some of the younger bikers, but Kane was undeterred. He leaned closer, peering through the open window. "What's the matter? Afraid to face me without an audience?" Kane taunted. "Get out of the truck." Noah sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt with deliberate slowness. He pushed the door open, forcing Kane to step back, and climbed out. Standing tall, his steady gaze swept over the gang. He noted their positions, the way some clutched at makeshift weapons while others kept their hands free, unsure of how far this confrontation would go. "You want to fight?" Noah said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Fine, but let's make it fair." Kane laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Fair? You're outnumbered 6-1. How's that fair?" Noah shrugged, stepping away from the truck. "Your numbers don't matter if you can't work together. Let's see what you got." The insult struck a nerve, and one of the bikers, a wiry man with a jagged scar on his jaw, charged forward, brandishing a length of chain. Noah sidestepped the attack with ease, grabbing the chain and yanking it from the man's grip. Before the biker could react, Noah swept his legs out from under him, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The gang hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the speed and precision of Noah's movements. Kane snarled in frustration, gesturing for the others to attack. Two more bikers rushed at Noah, their footsteps kicking up dust as they tried to flank him. Noah moved with practiced efficiency. He ducked under one swing, pivoted to avoid another, and delivered a sharp elbow to the ribs of the nearest biker. The man crumpled with a grunt, clutching his side. The second attacker tried to grapple him, but Noah shifted his weight, using the man's momentum against him to send him crashing to the ground. "You're making this too easy," Noah said, straightening as he turned to face the remaining bikers. "Do you even know what you're fighting for?" Kane stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Shut up and fight," he roared, lunging at Noah with fists swinging wildly. Noah sidestepped the first punch and caught Kane's arm mid-swing. Twisting sharply, he forced Kane to his knees. The gang watched in stunned silence as their leader struggled, his face contorted in pain. "This is over," Noah said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Walk away while you still can." Kane gritted his teeth, refusing to concede. "Not until you're down," he spat, his free hand reaching for a knife hidden in his boot. Noah saw the movement and reacted instantly, kicking the blade from Kane's hand before it could reach him. The knife clattered to the ground, and Noah released Kane's arm, stepping back to give him space. "I warned you," Noah said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the most defiant of the gang. "You don't want to take this any further." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader was on his knees, and the man who had taken down 3 of them without breaking a sweat stood unscathed. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and it wasn't one they had prepared for. One of the younger bikers, Max, broke the silence. "Kane, maybe we should just leave," he said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Kane shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "We're not leaving," he barked, though his tone lacked its usual authority. Noah tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking on Max. "Smart kid," he said. "You should listen to him." The comment drew a flicker of uncertainty from Max, who seemed to be reconsidering his loyalty. Kane, however, was too blinded by pride to back down. He staggered to his feet, his fists clenched tightly. "This isn't over," Kane growled, his voice hoarse. "You hear me, soldier? This isn't over. Noah didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his truck, his back straight and his pace unhurried. The gang parted to let him through, their earlier bravado replaced by a mixture of fear and respect. As Noah climbed into the cab and started the engine, he spared a glance in the rearview mirror. The bikers stood in a loose cluster, their leader seething while the others exchanged uncertain looks. Max lingered at the edge of the group, his gaze following Noah's truck as it disappeared into the twilight. For now, the fight was over. But Noah knew better than to assume it was the end. Men like Cain didn't let go of grudges easily. Whatever came next, Noah would be ready. The truck rumbled down the empty stretch of road, the faint glow of the dashboard lights casting shadows across Noah's face. His hands gripped the wheel loosely, his body relaxed, but his mind was far from at ease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Cain and his gang wasn't truly over. Men like Cain didn't take defeat lightly, especially not in front of their subordinates. Sure enough, several miles down the road, the faint roar of engines reached his ears. They weren't close yet, but they were gaining ground. Noah's jaw tightened as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The night sky stretched endlessly above him, and the road ahead offered little cover or opportunity to lose his pursuers. He would have to think fast. Meanwhile, Cain was seething. His pride was in tatters, and every mile his bike ate up felt like salt in the wound. His gang trailed behind him, their enthusiasm for revenge tempered by the memory of Noah's swift and efficient takedown. Cain's glare swept over his crew as they rode in formation. He couldn't afford to show weakness now, not if he wanted to maintain control. "We're going to show that soldier boy who's in charge," Cain shouted over the roar of the engines, his voice crackling through the night air. "No one makes fools out of us." Max, riding near the back of the group, exchanged a wary glance with the biker beside him. He'd seen the look in Noah's eyes, the kind of calm confidence that came from experience, not arrogance. Max wasn't sure if this pursuit was a good idea, but he wasn't ready to voice his doubts. Not yet. Back in the truck, Noah made a decision. Spotting a small, unmarked dirt road branching off the highway, he slowed down and turned onto it. The path was rough, barely more than a trail cutting through the scrubland, but it would give him the chance to stage his defense. He drove a short distance before stopping the truck in a clearing. The roar of the biker's engines grew louder, the sound vibrating through the night like an ominous drumbeat. Noah stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the dirt. He took a moment to survey the area. The terrain was uneven, with patches of dry grass and scattered rocks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He moved quickly, gathering a few heavy stones and positioning them strategically along the trail. His movements were purposeful, every action part of a plan forming in his mind. The gang arrived moments later, their bikes skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. Cain dismounted first, his expression a mask of fury and determination. The others followed suit, their movements less confident but still aggressive. "Thought you could run, huh?" Cain said, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. "Looks like you just made it easier for us to catch you." Noah didn't respond immediately. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but ready. "You had your chance to walk away," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "You chose this." Cain smirked, pulling a length of chain from his belt. "Damn right we did, and now we're going to finish it." As the gang spread out, Noah moved into action. The first biker to charge him found his path blocked by one of the rocks Noah had positioned earlier. He stumbled, losing his footing, and Noah capitalized on the moment, delivering a swift, precise strike that left the man sprawling in the dirt. The next two bikers were more cautious, trying to flank him from either side, but Noah was ready. He used the terrain to his advantage, maneuvering them into positions where they couldn't easily coordinate their attacks. A sharp jab here, a calculated sweep of his leg there, and both men were soon incapacitated. Cain watched, his frustration mounting. "What are you idiots doing? Get him!" he barked, his voice edged with desperation. Max hesitated. He could see the futility of the fight, but Cain's authority still held sway. Reluctantly, he stepped forward, only to stop when Noah turned his gaze on him. "You don't have to do this," Noah said, his tone steady but not unkind. "You're better than this." Max froze, the words hitting him harder than any punch could. For a moment he considered stepping back, but Kane's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Don't listen to him, Max," Kane shouted. "He's just trying to mess with your head." Noah didn't press the point. He turned his attention back to Kane, who was now advancing with the chain swinging menacingly in his hand. Kane's movements were erratic, driven more by anger than strategy. Noah waited, his stance calm and unyielding, until Kane was close enough to strike. When the attack came, it was wild and uncontrolled. Noah ducked under the first swing and stepped inside Kane's guard, grabbing his wrist and twisting sharply. The chain clattered to the ground as Kane cried out in pain. Noah didn't let go immediately, forcing Kane to his knees before releasing him. "This is your last warning," Noah said, his voice low and firm. "Walk away before someone gets hurt." Kane glared up at him, his expression a mixture of anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he shoved himself to his feet and staggered back toward his bike. "Let's go," Kane growled, his voice barely audible. "We'll deal with him later." The gang hesitated, their eyes flicking between Kane and Noah. Max was the first to move, turning his bike around and starting the engine. The others followed reluctantly, their earlier bravado replaced by a tense silence. Kane mounted his bike last, casting one final glare at Noah before roaring off into the night. As the dust settled and the sound of the engines faded, Noah let out a slow breath. The fight was over, but the war wasn't. He could see it in Kane's eyes, the promise of retaliation, the refusal to let go. Noah knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. For now, though, he had won, and that was enough. The faint smell of rain lingered in the air as Noah guided his truck down the desolate highway. He hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour, and the stretch of road seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The hum of the engine was steady, a soothing backdrop to his thoughts, but Noah's instincts kept him alert. He knew better than to trust the calm. It was often the quiet moments that preceded the storm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Noah noticed something in the distance. The silhouette of a semi-truck loomed ahead, parked diagonally across both lanes. Its hazard lights blinked dimly, casting faint flashes of red into the growing darkness. A figure stood beside the truck, waving frantically. Noah slowed down, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The figure, a young man, appeared distressed, but something about the scene felt off. The semi was positioned too perfectly to block the road, and the surrounding area offered no signs of an accident. Noah's grip tightened on the steering wheel as his training kicked in. He brought the truck to a halt several yards away and killed the engine. His hand instinctively brushed against the handle of the crowbar he kept under the seat. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the sound of the door closing seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Hey, can you help me out?" the young man called, his voice carrying a note of desperation. He gestured toward the semi. "The engine's dead, and I'm stranded out here." Noah didn't respond immediately. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. His eyes swept the scene, taking in every detail. The way the man kept glancing over his shoulder, the faint scuff marks on the pavement near the truck, the unnatural silence beyond the man's voice. "Rough spot to break down," Noah said finally, his tone neutral. He stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his muscles coiled, ready for action. "Yeah," the man said, shifting on his feet. "Came out of nowhere. Could really use a hand pushing it to the side." Noah's eyes flicked to the truck again. "A rig that size? Not without a tow." The young man hesitated, his confidence wavering under Noah's scrutiny. Before he could respond, the faint crunch of footsteps reached Noah's ears. He turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the shadows shifting near the edge of the road. More figures emerged, 5 in total, their faces partially obscured by bandanas and hoodies. "Well," Noah muttered under his breath, "there's the rest of the welcoming committee." Kane stepped into view, his scar catching the last rays of sunlight. "Told you we'd meet again, soldier boy," he said, a smug grin spreading across his face. He gestured to the young man who quickly backed away to join the others. "This time, you don't get to walk away." Noah's expression didn't change, but his mind worked rapidly, cataloging options and assessing his surroundings. The terrain was uneven, with a ditch running parallel to the road on one side and a dense thicket of brush on the other. The semi-truck was an obstacle, but it could also be a shield if used correctly. "You've gone through a lot of trouble for a fight you can't win," Noah said, his voice calm but laced with an edge that made the gang hesitate. Kane's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he barked a laugh. "You think you're clever, don't you? This isn't the gas station, old man. You're outnumbered, and we've got you boxed in." The gang began to fan out, forming a loose semicircle around Noah. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Noah slowly backed toward his truck, his movements deliberate. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around a small flashlight he always carried. "Last chance to walk away," Noah said, his tone even. "You're not ready for this." Kane snorted. "The only one walking away is me, with the satisfaction of seeing you on the ground." Noah didn't respond. Instead, he turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward Kane's face. The sudden burst of light disoriented the gang leader, who stumbled back, cursing. At the same time, Noah moved. In a single fluid motion, he ducked behind his truck and pulled the crowbar from under the seat. The first attacker reached him, swinging a length of pipe, but Noah blocked the strike with ease, countering with a swift blow to the man's knee. The biker crumpled with a shout, his weapon clattering to the ground. Another gang member lunged at Noah, but he sidestepped, using the momentum to send the man crashing into the side of the truck. A third tried to grapple him, but Noah dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The fight was chaotic but methodical. Noah's movements were precise, each action designed to neutralize rather than maim. The gang's attempts to overwhelm him with sheer numbers were futile. Their lack of coordination made them easy to outmaneuver. Kane, watching from a safe distance, clenched his fists in frustration. "You idiots!" he shouted. "Take him down already!" Max hesitated at the edge of the fray, his grip on a crowbar tightening. He had seen enough to know this wasn't a fair fight. Not for Noah, but for them. The soldier wasn't just skilled. He was deliberate, calculating, and far more experienced than any of them. Max's gaze shifted to Kane, whose anger was bordering on desperation. "Max!" Kane barked, noticing the younger man's inaction. "Get in there!" Max took a step forward, then stopped. "Maybe we should just leave," he said, his voice uncertain. "What did you say?" Kane demanded, turning on him. Max met his gaze, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "I said maybe we should leave. We're not going to win this." Kane's face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, Noah's voice cut through the tension. "He's right," Noah said, his tone calm but commanding. "This isn't worth it." Kane glared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment it seemed as though he might call off the attack. Then, with a growl of frustration, he waved his hand. "Fall back. We're done here." The gang retreated reluctantly, their defeat palpable in the heavy silence that followed. Kane shot Noah a look of pure hatred before turning and stalking back toward his bike. Noah stood still, his breathing steady as he watched them disappear into the night. He knew this wasn't over, but for now, it was enough. He leaned against the truck, the weight of the moment settling over him. The ambush had failed, but the fight was far from finished. Kane sat alone in the dim light of a rundown bar, nursing a whiskey that did little to calm the storm raging inside him. The gang was gone for the night, their enthusiasm for revenge thoroughly doused after the failed ambush. Kane's pride, however, was far from quelled. His fingers drummed an uneven rhythm on the scarred wooden table, his mind replaying the confrontation with Noah again and again. "Damn him," Kane muttered under his breath, the words barely audible over the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner. He tipped his glass back, the liquor burning its way down his throat. The sting was familiar, comforting even. It reminded him of simpler times before he'd become the man he was now. Kane hadn't always been the hardened gang leader he appeared to be. Once, he'd been a scared kid growing up in a rundown trailer park on the edge of a dying town. His father had been a shadowy presence, always on the move, leaving Kane and his mother to fend for themselves. Kane's memories of his mother were bittersweet, a woman who worked tirelessly to provide for him but carried the weight of too many broken dreams. The first time Kane got into a fight, he was 12. A bigger kid had been taunting him about his clothes, second-hand and worn thin. Kane had ignored the taunts at first, his mother's voice echoing in his mind. "Be the bigger person, Kane. Walk away." But when the bigger kid shoved him to the ground, something inside Kane snapped. He'd lashed out, fists flying until the other boy lay bloody and crying on the ground. It was the first time Kane had felt powerful, and he liked it. From then on, Kane's life became a series of battles, some physical, others mental. By the time he was 16, he'd been in and out of juvenile detention more times than he could count. His mother had tried to help him, pleading with him to change, but Kane couldn't, or wouldn't. He saw the world as a battlefield, and he was determined never to be the one left bleeding again. As Kane got older, his reputation grew. By his early 20s, he'd fallen in with a local biker gang, drawn to the camaraderie and the illusion of control it offered. The gang became his family, and the road became his home. He quickly climbed the ranks, his ruthlessness and cunning earning him respect and fear. When the former leader was arrested, Kane stepped into the role without hesitation. But leadership wasn't what Kane had imagined it would be. The loyalty of his gang was tenuous at best, rooted more in fear than admiration. The constant need to assert his dominance weighed on him, a burden he couldn't shake. And yet, he couldn't let it go. The thought of being seen as weak, of losing the power he'd fought so hard to gain, was unbearable. The encounter with Noah had shaken something loose in Kane, a memory he'd buried long ago. It wasn't just the defeat that bothered him. It was the way Noah had carried himself. The calm, unshakable confidence reminded Kane of a man he'd once known, his uncle, Victor. Victor had been a soldier, a decorated war hero who had returned home with stories that both fascinated and terrified Kane. As a child, Kane had idolized his uncle, hanging on every word he said. But Victor had also been a broken man, haunted by the things he'd seen and done. Kane had watched as his hero succumbed to alcoholism, his once bright eyes dulling with each passing year. When Victor died, Kane had been 16. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by family and a few old war buddies. Kane had stood by the casket, staring at his uncle's lifeless face, and vowed that he would never end up like him. Weak, defeated, a shadow of the man he'd once been. But as Kane sat in the bar that night, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd broken that promise. He'd built his life on strength and control, but was he any better off than Victor had been? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling in its clarity. The bartender, a grizzled man with a face that had seen too much, approached with a bottle in hand. "Another round?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Kane shook his head. "Nah, I'm good." The bartender nodded and moved on, leaving Kane alone with his thoughts. He stared into the amber liquid in his glass, his reflection distorted and fractured. For the first time in years, Kane felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He thought of the gang, Max in particular. The kid had potential, but he was already starting to question Kane's authority. It was only a matter of time before others followed suit. Kane clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling to the surface. He needed to regain control, to remind them why he was the leader. But how? The question lingered, unanswered as the hours stretched on. Kane's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a message from one of the gang members. "What's the plan, boss?" Kane didn't reply right away. He stared at the words, his mind racing. He needed a plan, something big, something that would not only reestablish his dominance but also give him the satisfaction of seeing Noah brought low. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. It would never be enough. With a heavy sigh, Kane drained the last of his whiskey and stood. The bar was nearly empty now, the jukebox playing a slow, mournful tune. Kane threw a few bills on the table and walked out into the night. The air was cool, the sky a canvas of stars, but Kane felt none of its beauty. His thoughts were fixed on the road ahead, on the battles yet to come. As he climbed onto his bike and revved the engine, Kane made a silent vow. He would find a way to take Noah down, no matter what it cost. But even as the engine roared to life and the night swallowed him whole, a small, nagging voice whispered in the back of his mind, asking a question he couldn't answer. What happens when there's nothing left to fight for? The gas station had a different energy at night. The hum of the fluorescent lights was more noticeable in the quiet, and the faint buzz of insects filled the air outside. Noah pulled his truck into the lot, its engine sputtering slightly before quieting as he turned the key. The long stretch of road behind him felt like another battlefield he'd just left, but something about the dimly lit station gave him a rare sense of calm. Claire, the gas station attendant, was leaning on the counter, flipping through an old paperback novel. She looked up as the door's bell jingled, her tired eyes softening when she saw who it was. "Well, if it isn't our soldier back from the front lines," she said, setting the book down. "You look like you've been through it." Noah offered her a faint smile. "You could say that." Claire was in her late 40s, her face weathered but kind. She'd worked at the station for as long as anyone in town could remember, and she had a knack for reading people. As Noah approached the counter, she tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was an old puzzle she was determined to solve. "More trouble with Kane and his boys?" she asked, already guessing the answer. Noah nodded, placing a bottle of water and a pack of jerky on the counter. "They don't seem to know when to quit." Claire sighed, ringing up his items. "They've been like that for years. Kane's always had a chip on his shoulder, and those boys follow him like he's the Pied Piper. You'd think they'd have better sense by now." Noah didn't respond right away. He handed her a few bills, then leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "Why do they follow him?" he asked after a moment. "What's he got that keeps them loyal?" Claire shrugged, handing him his change. "Fear, mostly. Kane's got a way of making you think crossing him isn't worth it. But it's more than that. He gives them something to belong to. For guys like that, it's enough." Noah considered her words as he opened the water bottle and took a sip. Claire watched him, her curiosity piqued. There was something about him that didn't quite fit with the quiet, rugged demeanor he projected. "You've been through more than you let on," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "Guys like Kane don't shake you. You're used to worse." Noah met her gaze, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He wasn't used to people reading him so easily. "Something like that," he said finally. Claire didn't push further, but her expression told him she understood more than he was saying. She gestured toward a stool by the counter. "Why don't you sit for a while? You look like you could use a break." Noah hesitated, then nodded. He pulled the stool out and sat down, resting his forearms on the counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Claire picked up her book again but didn't read, her attention still partially on him. "You know," she said after a while, "Kane wasn't always like this." Noah raised an eyebrow. "No?" Claire shook her head. Back when he first started coming around, he was just a kid. Full of anger, sure, but not this. There was a time when he actually tried to turn things around. "What happened?" Claire hesitated, weighing her words. "Life happened. Same story as a lot of folks around here. No money, no options, too many people letting him down. He found his way to that gang, and the rest is history." Noah nodded slowly. He'd seen it before. Anger left unchecked. Bitterness taking root until it became the only thing driving a person forward. It was a cycle that was hard to break, but not impossible. The door jingled again, cutting into their conversation. A man stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a quiet intensity that reminded Noah of his own military days. The man's eyes scanned the room, briefly landing on Noah before moving to Claire. "Evening," the stranger said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that suggested he wasn't just passing through. "Evening," Claire replied, her tone polite but wary. "What can I do for you?" The man walked up to the counter, his movements deliberate. "Just passing through. Thought I'd grab some coffee." Claire nodded, gesturing to the machine in the corner. As the stranger moved to pour himself a cup, Noah watched him closely. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, an air of discipline and purpose that was hard to miss. When the man returned to the counter, he glanced at Noah again. "Long night?" he asked, his tone conversational but with an edge that suggested he already knew the answer. "Something like that," Noah replied evenly. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if he'd confirmed something for himself. "Name's Reed," he said, extending a hand. Noah hesitated briefly before shaking it. "Noah." "Good to meet you, Noah." Reed glanced at Claire. "And you?" "Claire," she said, still watching him closely. "You military, Reed?" Reed smiled faintly. "Used to be, same as him, I'd guess." He nodded toward Noah. Noah's expression didn't change, but the tension in his posture eased slightly. "What brings you out here?" "Work," Reed said simply. "And maybe a little curiosity. Heard some stories about a soldier out here making waves." Noah's eyes narrowed. "What kind of stories?" Reed shrugged. "The kind that make people take notice. You've got a reputation, whether you wanted it or not." Noah leaned back slightly, considering Reed's words. He didn't like the idea of people talking about him, but he couldn't say he was surprised. Trouble had a way of drawing attention. Reed finished his coffee and set the empty cup on the counter. "Well, I should be on my way. Nice meeting you, Noah. Claire." As he turned to leave, Noah called after him. "What kind of work?" Reed paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "The kind that finds people like you," he said cryptically. Then he was gone, the door jingling shut behind him. Claire and Noah exchanged a look, the air between them heavy with unspoken questions. Claire was the first to break the silence. "What do you think that was about?" Noah shook his head. "Not sure, but I don't think we've seen the last of him." Claire nodded, a hint of unease creeping into her expression. "Be careful, Noah. There's more going on here than meets the eye." Noah didn't respond. He stood, thanked her for the water, and left the station, his thoughts already turning to the stranger and the implications of his words. The road ahead felt darker than ever, and for the first time in a long while, Noah wasn't sure what he'd find waiting for him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm orange glow over the desert landscape as Noah stepped out of his truck. He had parked near an abandoned rest stop, the kind of place that had long been forgotten by travelers and time. The faded paint on the building peeled away in long strips, and the cracked pavement was dotted with tufts of hardy grass that had found a way to thrive in the desolation. Noah stretched, the muscles in his shoulders and back groaning in protest after another restless night. He had slept in the truck, his mind too preoccupied with the events of the past few days to find peace. Between Kane's gang, the mysterious stranger Reed, and the growing sense of unease that seemed to follow him, Noah felt like he was on the edge of something he couldn't quite define. The rest stop was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the soft rustle of the wind. Noah took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs and grounding him. He needed to think, to prepare for whatever was coming. His instincts told him that Cain wasn't done with him, and Reed's cryptic words lingered in his mind like an unsolved puzzle. Noah walked to the edge of the rest stop's lot, his boots crunching on the gravel. From this vantage point he could see the road stretching out in both directions, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. It was a reminder of how far he had come, and how far he still had to go. He spent the morning making preparations. The rest stop had a small utility shed out back, its lock rusted and easy to break. Inside he found a few useful items: a length of rope, an old toolbox, and a stack of wooden pallets. It wasn't much, but it was enough to work with. Noah set about creating makeshift defenses, positioning the pallets strategically to create cover and tying the rope in ways that could be used to trip or ensnare an unsuspecting attacker. As he worked, his mind drifted to Reed. The man's sudden appearance and cryptic remarks had left Noah with more questions than answers. Who was he? And why did he seem so interested in Noah's reputation? There was something about Reed's demeanor that reminded Noah of his own military days, a calm confidence that came from experience. But what kind of experience? Noah pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. By midday, the rest stop looked less like an abandoned pit stop and more like a makeshift fortress. Noah had even rigged a few traps using the toolbox and some scrap metal he'd found in the shed. They weren't lethal. Noah didn't want to kill anyone, but they would be enough to slow down or incapacitate anyone who tried to approach without caution. Satisfied with his work, Noah took a break under the shade of a crumbling awning. He sipped water from his canteen, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The stillness of the desert was deceptive. He knew it wouldn't last. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran. As the afternoon wore on, Noah's thoughts turned to Cain. The gang leader's pride had been wounded, and Noah knew from experience that men like Cain didn't let things go easily. Cain would come for him. Of that, Noah was certain. The question was when and how. The answer came sooner than Noah expected. Just before sunset, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines reached his ears. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the whisper of the wind, but it grew louder with each passing minute. Noah stood, his body tensing as he scanned the horizon. A plume of dust rose in the distance, marking the gang's approach. He moved quickly, double-checking his preparations and positioning himself near the utility shed. From here, he had a clear view of the rest stop's entrance and the surrounding area. He gripped the crowbar he had taken from his truck, its weight familiar and comforting in his hands. The gang arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lot. There were 7 of them this time, their bikes growling like predators circling their prey. Cain was at the front, his expression a mixture of anger and determination. He dismounted first, his movements deliberate as he surveyed the rest stop. "Soldier boy," Cain called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "We know you're here. Why don't you come out and save us the trouble?" Noah didn't respond. He stayed hidden, his breathing steady as he watched the gang spread out. They moved cautiously, their earlier bravado tempered by the memory of their last encounter with him. Cain barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding, but Noah could see the cracks in their confidence. One of the bikers tripped a wire Noah had set near the entrance, triggering a cascade of empty cans and scrap metal that clattered noisily to the ground. The sudden noise startled the gang, and a few of them jumped back, their nerves fraying. "Stay sharp," Cain snapped, his frustration evident. "He's trying to mess with us." Noah used the distraction to reposition, moving silently from the utility shed to a stack of pallets near the center of the lot. From here, he could see Max lingering at the edge of the group, his expression hesitant. The younger biker hadn't attacked during the last fight, and Noah wondered if he would hold back again. The gang continued their search, their movements growing more erratic as the minutes dragged on. Cain's anger was palpable, his shouts growing louder and more desperate. Noah stayed patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. When it came, it was almost too easy. One of the bikers ventured too close to the pallets, his attention focused elsewhere. Noah stepped out, his movements swift and precise. A quick strike with the crowbar sent the man sprawling, his weapon clattering to the ground. The gang turned as one, their surprise quickly morphing into rage. Noah stood his ground, his expression calm but resolute. "You should have walked away," he said, his voice carrying over the tense silence. Kane's face twisted with fury and he pointed at Noah. "Get him!" The gang charged, but Noah was ready. The traps he had set slowed their advance, tripping some and forcing others to take longer routes around the obstacles. Noah moved with practiced efficiency, using the pallets for cover and striking with precision when the opportunity arose. Max hesitated at the edge of the chaos, his gaze shifting between Kane and Noah. For a moment he looked as though he might intervene, but he stayed where he was. His expression conflicted. As the fight wore on, it became clear that the gang was outmatched. One by one, they fell, their confidence crumbling under the weight of Noah's skill and strategy. Kane was the last to fall, his knees hitting the ground as he gasped for breath. Noah stood over him, his breathing steady despite the exertion. "It's over," Noah said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Walk away, Kane. Don't come back." Kane glared up at him, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. But as he looked around at his fallen crew, the fight drained out of him. With a growl of frustration, he nodded. "Let's go," he spat, motioning for the others to retreat. Noah watched as the gang limped away, their bikes kicking up dust as they roared off into the night. He didn't relax until the sound of their engines faded completely. The rest stop was silent once more, but Noah knew the peace wouldn't last. The storm had passed, for now, but another was always on the horizon. The gas station was unusually quiet when Noah returned the next morning. The warm scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the faint tang of gasoline. Claire, as always, was at the counter, flipping through a magazine that looked older than some of the snacks on the shelves. She looked up as Noah walked in, her expression a mixture of curiosity and relief. "Back so soon?" she asked, setting the magazine aside. "Couldn't stay away," Noah replied dryly, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler. He set it on the counter, but before Claire could ring it up, the familiar rumble of motorcycles reached their ears. The sound was distant, but growing louder by the second. Claire's face tightened. "You expecting company?" Noah shook his head, already turning toward the door. "Not exactly." Outside, the sun was climbing higher, casting sharp shadows across the parking lot. The gang appeared moments later, their bikes forming a loose line as they roared into the lot. Kane was at the center, his posture rigid and his expression grim. This time, however, there were fewer of them. Noah counted 5, including Max, who lingered at the back with a look that bordered on reluctance. Kane killed his engine first, the others following suit. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint clicking of cooling engines. Kane swung a leg over his bike and stood, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached Noah. "Thought we made ourselves clear," Kane said, his voice low and steady. "This isn't over." Noah met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "It is, if you walk away." Kane smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts won't get you far." The rest of the gang dismounted, their movements less confident than Kane's. Max hung back, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his eyes darting between Noah and Kane. It was clear he didn't want to be there, but whatever loyalty he felt to Kane was keeping him tethered. "Last chance," Kane said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Come quietly, and we'll call it even." Noah tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "We both know that's not how this ends." Kane's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of frustration. "Fine," he snapped. "Have it your way." The gang moved as one, their previous hesitations melting away as they followed Kane's lead. Noah didn't wait for them to close the distance. He sidestepped toward a nearby stack of crates, using them as cover as the first biker lunged at him. The man swung a crowbar, but Noah ducked, driving an elbow into his attacker's ribs. The biker stumbled, dropping his weapon with a pained grunt. Another came at Noah from the side, wielding a tire iron. Noah blocked the strike with his forearm, the impact reverberating through his bones. He twisted sharply, disarming the man and sending him sprawling to the ground. The fight was chaotic, a flurry of movement and noise that seemed to blur together. Noah's military training kicked in, his actions swift and efficient. He wasn't trying to hurt them, at least not permanently, but he wasn't holding back either. Each move was calculated, designed to neutralize the threat as quickly as possible. Kane stayed back, watching as his crew faltered one by one. His jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. He shouted orders, his voice rising above the clamor, but it was clear his control over the gang was slipping. Max hesitated at the edge of the fray, his expression conflicted. He took a tentative step forward, then stopped, his gaze locking onto Noah. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the noise of the fight fading into the background. "You don't have to do this," Noah said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "This isn't who you are." Max's brow furrowed, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," Noah admitted, "but I know you don't belong here." Max's grip on the tire iron he was holding loosened, and he took a step back. Kane noticed the exchange, his frustration boiling over. "Max!" he barked. "Get over here and do your job." Max froze, torn between obedience and the flickering desire to break free. Kane's glare was sharp enough to cut steel, but Max didn't move. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. The remaining bikers, battered and demoralized, retreated toward their bikes. Kane stood motionless for a moment, his chest heaving as he glared at Noah. Then, with a growl of frustration, he turned and stalked back to his motorcycle. "This isn't over," Kane spat as he mounted his bike. "Not by a long shot." Noah didn't respond. He watched in silence as the gang roared out of the parking lot, their departure leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Max lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Noah's one last time before he followed the others. The dust settled, and the parking lot was quiet once more. Claire stepped out of the gas station, her arms crossed and her expression wary. "You okay?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Noah nodded, though his body was tense and his mind was racing. "For now." Claire shook her head, her concern evident. "They're not going to stop, you know. Kane's got too much pride for that." "I know," Noah said, his tone resigned but determined. "But neither will I." Claire sighed, then gave him a small, tired smile. "You're a stubborn one, that's for sure." Noah returned the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The fight was far from over, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it now. He had to stay focused, to be ready for whatever came next. As he climbed back into his truck and started the engine, Noah's gaze drifted to the horizon. The road ahead was long, and the battle wasn't done, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't back down. The night air was thick with tension as Max rode at the back of the group, his motorcycle humming softly beneath him. The gang had been unusually quiet since leaving the gas station, their earlier bravado stripped away by the confrontation with Noah. Kane, as always, rode at the front, his posture rigid and his face unreadable. Max could tell he was angry, but it wasn't the same fiery anger that usually drove him. This was colder, more calculating. And that scared Max more than anything. They pulled into a clearing off the main road, their makeshift hideout nestled in the shadows of a cluster of trees. It was nothing more than an abandoned barn and a few scattered vehicles, but it had served them well over the years. The gang parked their bikes in silence, the only sounds the clicking of cooling engines and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Kane dismounted first, slamming his helmet onto the seat of his bike. "Inside," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. The gang followed without hesitation, their movements subdued. Max lingered at the back, his hands gripping the handlebars of his bike as he debated whether to follow. Inside the barn, the atmosphere was oppressive. Kane paced near the center, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The rest of the gang stood around him, their expressions a mixture of frustration and unease. Max slipped in quietly, hoping to go unnoticed, but Kane's sharp eyes found him immediately. "Glad you could join us," Kane said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You want to tell me what that was back there?" Max shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, you don't?" Kane stepped closer, his voice rising. "You froze. Again. While the rest of us were out there fighting, you stood there like a deer in the headlights." Max clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" Kane demanded, his eyes narrowing. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were thinking about switching sides." The barn fell silent, the weight of Kane's accusation hanging heavy in the air. The other gang members shifted uneasily, their gazes darting between Kane and Max. No one spoke, the tension thick enough to choke on. Max took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Kane's glare. "I wasn't going to switch sides," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "But maybe he's got a point." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Kane's eyes widened, his disbelief quickly morphing into fury. "A point?" he spat. "That guy's the enemy, Max. He's the reason we keep losing." "Maybe we're losing because we keep picking fights we can't win," Max shot back before he could stop himself. A collective gasp rippled through the gang, and Max immediately regretted his outburst. Kane took a step closer, his face inches from Max's. "You want to say that again?" he hissed. Max swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I'm just saying, maybe we should think this through," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Every time we go after him, it ends the same way. Maybe there's another way to handle this." Kane stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he grabbed Max by the collar and shoved him against the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of Max's lungs, and he gasped as Kane's grip tightened. "You listen to me," Kane growled, his voice low and dangerous. "There is no other way. That guy made fools out of us, and I'm not going to let that slide. You don't want to fight? Fine, but don't you dare question me." Max nodded stiffly, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Kane held him there for a moment longer, then released him with a shove. Max stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and anger. Kane turned back to the rest of the gang, his voice rising as he addressed them. "We're not backing down. Not now, not ever. That guy thinks he's better than us, and I'm going to prove him wrong. Anyone who's not on board can leave right now." No one moved. Max glanced around, his heart sinking as he realized that, despite their unease, the gang wasn't going to challenge Kane. They were too afraid, too loyal, or too stubborn to see the truth. "Good," Kane said, satisfied with their silence. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we come up with a plan." The gang began to disperse, their footsteps heavy as they moved toward their sleeping areas. Max stayed where he was, his mind racing. He didn't want to be there anymore, didn't want to be a part of Kane's vendetta. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. The gang was all he had ever known, and Kane didn't take kindly to deserters. Later that night, as the others slept, Max sat outside the barn, staring up at the stars. The cool night air did little to calm his nerves, and his thoughts were a chaotic swirl of doubt and fear. He thought about Noah, about the calm confidence in his voice and the way he had handled himself during the fight. It was a stark contrast to Kane's anger and recklessness. For the first time, Max wondered if there was another way, another path he could take. The thought terrified him, but it also sparked something deep inside, a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years. Max didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep following Kane. Not like this. He just needed to figure out what to do next. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Max made a silent promise to himself. Things had to change, and if Kane wasn't going to change, then Max would have to find the strength to do it on his own. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the barn's roof, casting thin rays of light onto the dusty floor. Inside, the gang gathered around Kane, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and apprehension. The previous night's confrontation with Max still hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Kane stood at the center, his presence dominating the room as he addressed them. "All right, listen up," Kane began, his voice sharp and commanding. "We've been through worse than this. That guy may have gotten the better of us a couple of times, but he's not invincible. He bleeds just like the rest of us." The gang murmured their agreement, though the enthusiasm was noticeably muted. Max lingered near the back, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the floor. He could feel Kane's words washing over him, but they didn't stick. The doubt that had taken root in his mind was growing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Kane continued, his tone growing more intense. "We need to hit him where it hurts. No more playing defense, no more waiting for him to come to us. We take the fight to him, and we end this once and for all." A few of the gang members nodded, but others exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a wiry man named Jace, cleared his throat. "Kane, maybe we should think this through. Every time we go after him, it ends the same way. We're not exactly winning here." Kane's eyes narrowed, his gaze snapping to Jace like a predator sizing up its prey. "You got something to say, Jace?" Jace hesitated, his confidence wavering under Kane's glare. "I'm just saying maybe there's a better way to handle this. What if we just leave him alone? Move on and focus on something else?" The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Kane stepped closer to Jace, his movements slow and deliberate. "Leave him alone," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You think that's an option?" Jace swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. "Maybe it should be. This isn't worth it, Kane. Not anymore." Kane's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he turned away, letting out a harsh laugh. "You hear that, everyone? Jace thinks we should just roll over and let that guy win." "I didn't say that," Jace protested, his voice rising. "I'm saying we need to be smart about this. Running headfirst into another fight isn't going to solve anything." Kane turned back to him, his eyes blazing. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about him. It's about respect. If we back down now, we lose everything." Max watched the exchange in silence, his stomach twisting into knots. He wanted to speak up, to back Jace up, but he knew what would happen if he did. Kane wasn't just angry. He was desperate. And desperate men were dangerous. The tension in the barn reached its breaking point when another gang member, a broad-shouldered man named Rick, stepped forward. "Jace might have a point," Rick said, his voice steady despite the risk. "We've been taking a lot of hits lately. Maybe it's time to regroup, figure out a different strategy." Kane's head snapped toward Rick, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You, too?" he snarled. "What's wrong with you people? You're supposed to have my back." Rick held his ground, his expression unflinching. "We do, Kane, but following you blindly isn't the same as having your back. Maybe it's time you listen to us for a change." The gang erupted into a low murmur, the division among them becoming more apparent with every passing second. Kane's control over the group, once ironclad, was slipping, and he knew it. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body taut with barely contained rage. "Fine," Kane said finally, his voice cold and sharp. "If you don't want to be here, then leave. Go ahead, but don't come crawling back when you realize you've got nothing without me." Rick exchanged a glance with Jace, then nodded. "Maybe we will," he said. but at least we'll still have our dignity." With that, Rick and Jace turned and walked out of the barn. A few others hesitated, their loyalty wavering as they watched the two men leave. Max felt his heart pounding in his chest as he weighed his options. Part of him wanted to follow them, to break free from Kane's toxic grip, but another part of him was paralyzed by fear. Fear of what Kane would do if he left, and fear of the unknown waiting beyond the gang. Kane watched the deserters leave, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. When the door slammed shut behind them, he turned back to the remaining gang members, his gaze sweeping over them like a storm cloud. "The rest of you," Kane said, his voice low and venomous, "better not even think about following them. We don't need cowards in this crew." The gang murmured their agreement, though their voices lacked conviction. Max stayed silent, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of doubt and fear. He knew he couldn't stay much longer, but he also knew leaving wouldn't be easy. As the meeting broke up and the gang dispersed, Max slipped outside, needing air. He leaned against the barn wall, staring out at the horizon as the sun climbed higher into the sky. His mind replayed the events of the morning, the division within the gang, and Kane's crumbling authority. Max didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was clear. The gang was falling apart, and if he didn't make a decision soon, he might be dragged down with it. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the deserted road. Noah sat on the hood of his truck, staring at the distant hills. The stillness of the desert was almost oppressive, a silence broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind. He sipped from his water bottle, his thoughts wandering back to a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The military had been Noah's escape, his way out of a small town with even smaller opportunities. He'd enlisted at 18, drawn by promises of purpose, structure, and a chance to see the world. What he hadn't anticipated was how much those years would shape him, or break him. His first deployment had been to a conflict zone halfway across the globe, a place where the air was thick with dust and tension. Noah had been young, eager to prove himself, and naive about the realities of war. The camaraderie of his unit had been his anchor, a makeshift family in a hostile world. They'd trained together, fought together, and bled together. But as the months dragged on, the weight of their losses began to take its toll. Noah's hands tightened around the bottle as memories flooded back, faces he hadn't thought about in years, voices that still echoed in his dreams. There was Sergeant Ruiz, the steady leader who had always seemed unshakable until the day he didn't come back from patrol. Private Daniels, barely out of high school, who had looked up to Noah like an older brother. And Miller, Noah's closest friend, whose laugh had been infectious even in the darkest moments. It was Miller's death that had broken something in Noah. They'd been on a routine convoy, the kind they'd done dozens of times before. The explosion had come out of nowhere, a deafening roar that turned the world into chaos. When the dust settled, Miller was gone, his spot in the vehicle reduced to twisted metal and ash. Noah had barely escaped with his life, but the guilt had been harder to survive. After the convoy, Noah had changed. The easygoing optimism that had once defined him was replaced by a quiet intensity. He threw himself into his work, taking on the most dangerous assignments as if he had something to prove, or something to atone for. His unit noticed the change, but no one dared to address it. In the military, grief was a burden you carried alone. Noah sighed, running a hand through his hair as he tried to push the memories away. They were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for quiet moments like this to resurface. He knew he couldn't change the past, couldn't bring back the people he'd lost. But the weight of their absence never got any lighter. His second deployment had been worse. The conflict was more volatile, the missions more dangerous. By then, Noah had been promoted to a leadership position, responsible for the lives of the men and women under his command. The pressure was immense, the stakes higher than ever. Every decision he made carried the potential for life or death, and every loss felt like a personal failure. There was one mission that still haunted him, a rescue operation that had gone disastrously wrong. They'd been tasked with extracting a group of civilians trapped in a hostile area. The intelligence had been flawed, the enemy presence underestimated. By the time they realized the scope of the danger, it was too late to turn back. Noah's unit had fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The civilians were evacuated, but at a heavy cost. 3 of his soldiers didn't make it out, their lives sacrificed for the mission's success. Noah had been hailed as a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He'd traded their lives for others, and the weight of that decision still pressed on him every day. A soft sound behind him pulled Noah from his thoughts. He turned to see Claire standing a few feet away, her expression cautious. She held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a look of quiet concern in her eyes. "Thought you might need this," she said, holding out the cup. Noah took it with a nod of thanks, the warmth seeping into his fingers. "You didn't have to come out here." Claire shrugged, leaning against the truck beside him. "Seemed like you could use some company." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle rustle of the wind. Claire didn't press him, didn't ask any questions, and Noah was grateful for that. She seemed to understand that some things were better left unsaid. "You've got that look," she said finally, her tone light but not unkind. "The one people get when they're carrying too much." Noah didn't respond immediately. He stared into the distance, the weight of her words settling over him. "It's not something you can just put down," he said quietly. "It stays with you." Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I don't know much about what you've been through, but I do know this. Carrying it alone doesn't make it lighter." Noah glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got a way with words." "Comes with the job," she said with a shrug. "You talk to enough people passing through, you start to pick up on things." They lapsed into silence again, but this time it was more comfortable. Noah sipped his coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the chill of his memories. Claire didn't push him to talk, didn't try to fix him. She just sat there, a quiet presence in the vastness of the desert. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Noah felt a small measure of peace settle over him. The past was still there, still heavy, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone under its weight. The desert night was cooler than usual, a crisp wind carrying the scent of sagebrush as Max sat alone outside the barn. The gang's makeshift hideout was quiet, its members either asleep or pretending to be. Max stared at the horizon, his mind racing with thoughts he could no longer ignore. The division within the gang, Kane's escalating obsession with Noah, and his own growing doubts weighed on him like stones. Max hadn't always been part of this life. There had been a time, not so long ago, when he'd dreamed of something better. Growing up, he'd wanted to be a mechanic, to work with his hands and build something meaningful. But life had other plans. His parents' divorce, his father's drinking, and the endless cycle of poverty had left him angry and aimless. When Kane had offered him a place in the gang, it had felt like salvation, a family, a purpose. Now, that sense of belonging was unraveling, and Max didn't know how to stop it. The sound of footsteps pulled Max from his thoughts. He turned to see Jace and Rick approaching, their silhouettes illuminated by the faint light of the moon. They carried themselves with quiet confidence, their decision to leave the gang clearly giving them a new sense of purpose. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" Jace said, sitting down beside Max. Max shook his head. "Lot on my mind." Rick leaned against the barn wall, crossing his arms. "You're not the only one. The way things are going, I wouldn't blame you if you were thinking about getting out." Max hesitated, his hands tightening around the tire iron he'd been fidgeting with. "It's not that simple." "Doesn't have to be complicated either," Rick said. "We walked away. You can too." "And then what?" Max snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You think Kane's just going to let me walk? He'll hunt me down, same as he's doing with Noah. Jace nodded slowly. You're not wrong. Kane doesn't take betrayal lightly. But here's the thing. He's losing his grip. You've seen it. The gang's falling apart and more people are starting to question him. He's not as invincible as he thinks he is. Max looked away, his jaw tightening. He wanted to believe them, to believe that leaving was possible. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. What if he doesn't stop? What if it gets worse? Rick exchanged a glance with Jace, then crouched down to Max's level. Then we make sure he can't hurt anyone else, Rick said, his voice firm. You're not alone in this, Max. We've got your back. Max studied them for a long moment, his heart pounding. The idea of standing against Kane terrified him, but it also sparked something else, a faint glimmer of hope. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he didn't have to do this alone. Before he could respond, the distant rumble of a motorcycle broke the silence. The three men tensed, their gazes snapping to the horizon. A single headlight appeared, growing brighter as it approached. Max felt his stomach twist. It wasn't one of the gang's bikes. He would have recognized the sound. The rider slowed as they neared the barn, pulling to a stop a few yards away. The engine cut off and the figure dismounted, their movements deliberate. It wasn't until the rider stepped into the moonlight that Max recognized him. Noah, Max said, his voice barely above a whisper. Noah's calm gaze swept over the group, lingering briefly on each of them. He didn't seem surprised to see them together, as if he'd expected this moment. Evening, Noah said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Didn't mean to interrupt. You've got guts showing up here, Jace said, his tone cautious. Kane's not exactly your biggest fan. Noah gave a small shrug. Figured I'd take my chances. Looked like you could use some company. Max stood, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Why are you here? Noah's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. Because you're not like the others. I've seen it. You don't belong in this mess, Max. Max felt his defenses rise, but the sincerity in Noah's voice gave him pause. You don't know me. I know enough, Noah replied. I know you've got a choice to make, and I know you're not the kind of person who wants to keep walking down this road. Rick stepped forward, his expression wary. What are you offering, exactly? Not an easy answer, Noah said, but I've been where you are, stuck between loyalty and doing what's right. It's not an easy place to be. Max stared at him, his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to dismiss Noah's words, to cling to the familiarity of the gang, even if it meant staying trapped, but another part of him, a part he hadn't let himself feel in a long time, wanted to believe that change was possible. You don't know what it's like, Max said, his voice trembling. Kane won't just let me walk away. Noah's gaze didn't waver. You're right, he won't. But you're not alone in this. You've got people who want to help you, if you let them. The weight of Noah's words settled over Max, heavy but not crushing. For the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope? Before Max could respond, the sound of voices inside the barn reached their ears. Kane's voice, sharp and angry, carried through the walls, followed by the heavy tread of boots. Noah stepped back, his posture calm but ready. You've got a decision to make, Noah said quietly, but you don't have to make it alone. With that, Noah turned and walked back to his bike. He mounted it with practiced ease, the engine roaring to life. Max watched him go, his mind racing with the possibilities that had been laid before him. Jace placed a hand on Max's shoulder. He's right, you know. You've got more support than you think. Max nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The time for indecision was over. Change was coming, and for the first time, Max was ready to meet it head-on. The barn was eerily quiet as the gang gathered around Kane. The tension in the room was palpable, making every creak of the wooden floor seem deafening. Kane stood at the center, his hands gripping the edge of a battered table. His knuckles were white and his jaw was set so tightly it looked like it might shatter. The others stood in a loose circle around him, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and unease. "Let me make one thing clear," Kane began, his voice low and dangerous. "What happened last night does not happen again." No one dared to speak. The events of the previous night, Noah's appearance and the growing cracks in their loyalty, had left the gang shaken. Kane's anger hung over them like a storm cloud, and no one wanted to be the first to feel its wrath. "Max," Kane said, snapping his gaze to the younger man. "You got something you want to tell me?" Max stiffened, his heart pounding. He could feel every set of eyes in the room on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical force. "No," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No?" Kane repeated, his tone mocking. "Then explain why you were out there, chatting it up with our enemy like your old friends." Max's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "He came to us," he said. "We didn't ask him to." "And you didn't think to, I don't know. Stop him," Kane snapped. "Or maybe let me know." "What would you have done?" Max shot back, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Gone out there guns blazing and made it worse?" The room went silent. Kane stared at Max, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. Slowly, he pushed away from the table and stepped closer, his movements deliberate and menacing. "You think you've got it all figured out, huh?" Kane said, his voice dangerously calm. "You think you're smarter than me?" Max swallowed hard but didn't look away. "I just think there's a better way to handle this." Kane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "A better way," he repeated. "You want to talk about a better way? Look around you, Max. This is the way. This is the only way." The gang shifted uneasily, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Even those who had stood by Kane through everything were starting to question him. The cracks in his leadership were becoming impossible to ignore. Jace, who had been watching the exchange from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Kane," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Max isn't wrong. This thing with Noah, it's tearing us apart. Maybe it's time to let it go." Kane turned on Jace so quickly it was almost a blur. "Let it go?" he snarled. "You think I can just let it go? That guy humiliated us. He made fools of us. If we back down now, we're done. Do you get that? We're done." "No, we're not," Jace said, his tone unyielding. "Not unless we keep letting this consume us. Look at what it's doing to us, Kane. Look at what it's doing to you." For a moment, Kane didn't respond. His chest heaved as he glared at Jace, his face contorted with rage. Then, without warning, he slammed his fist into the table, the sound echoing through the barn like a gunshot. The force of the blow sent papers and a half-empty bottle of whiskey clattering to the floor. "You think I don't know what it's doing to me?" Kane shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "You think I don't see it? I can't stop. Don't you get that? I can't stop until he pays for what he's done." The raw desperation in Kane's voice sent a ripple through the room. For the first time, the gang saw him not as the untouchable leader they had followed for years, but as a man unraveling under the weight of his own anger and pride. Rick, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Then maybe you shouldn't be leading us anymore," he said quietly. The room froze. Kane's head snapped toward Rick, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What did you just say?" Rick met his gaze without flinching. "You heard me. You're letting this thing with Noah destroy everything we've built. If you can't see that, then maybe it's time for someone else to take over." Kane's face twisted into a snarl, and for a moment it looked like he might lunge at Rick, but instead he turned away, pacing the room like a caged animal. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Kane stopped and faced the group. "Fine," he said, his voice low and icy. "You think you can do better? Be my guest. But don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." With that, Kane stormed out of the barn, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the stillness, leaving the gang in a stunned silence. No one moved, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a thick fog. Max let out a shaky breath, his heart pounding. For the first time, he saw Kane for what he really was. Not a leader, not a savior, but a man consumed by his own demons. And for the first time, Max felt like there might be a way out. The gas station stood bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Noah leaned against his truck, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The stillness of the desert evening was deceptive. He could feel the tension in the air, a storm brewing just beyond sight. Claire stepped out of the station, wiping her hands on a rag. She hesitated when she saw Noah's expression, then approached cautiously. "Expecting trouble?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Always," Noah replied without looking at her. He took a sip from his water bottle, his gaze unwavering. "It's only a matter of time." Claire sighed, crossing her arms as she stood beside him. "You don't have to face this alone, you know." "I've been alone for a long time," Noah said, his tone more reflective than bitter. "I'm used to it." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but the distant sound of engines cut her off. The low rumble grew louder with each passing second, the unmistakable growl of motorcycles echoing through the quiet. Claire tensed, her eyes darting to Noah. "They're here," she said. Noah nodded, his expression unreadable. "Stay inside," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Lock the door. Don't come out unless I tell you." Claire hesitated, then nodded and retreated into the station. Noah stepped away from the truck, his stance relaxed but purposeful. He watched as the motorcycles came into view, a line of headlights cutting through the dusk. At the front of the group was Kane, his expression a mask of controlled fury. The gang pulled into the lot, their bikes forming a semicircle around Noah. The engines cut off one by one, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Kane dismounted first, his movements deliberate as he approached Noah. "Thought you'd be gone by now," Kane said, his voice cold. "Smart man would have run." Noah met his gaze, his expression calm. "I'm not running." Kane's smirk was humorless. "Of course not. Too much pride for that, right?" Noah didn't respond, his silence more unsettling than any words could have been. Kane took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, soldier boy. Time we settled this." "You sure that's what you want?" Noah asked, his tone even. "You've got a choice here, Kane. Walk away, and no one gets hurt." Kane's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Walk away? You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you and me. It's about respect. If I let you get away with this, I lose everything." "You've already lost more than you realize," Noah said, his voice calm but firm. "You're tearing your own gang apart." Kane's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, Max stepped forward. "Kane, maybe he's right," Max said, his voice shaking slightly. "We don't have to do this." Kane turned on him, his expression a mix of disbelief and rage. "Not you too," he spat. "You're going to side with him?" "I'm not siding with anyone," Max said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time to let this go. Look around, Kane. The gang's falling apart. This isn't who we are." Kane's face twisted in fury. "You don't get to decide who we are," he growled. "I do, and if you're not with me, you're against me." The tension in the air was suffocating, the gang watching the exchange with wide eyes. Jace and Rick exchanged glances, their unease clear. It was obvious that Kane's grip on the gang was slipping, his desperation driving him to extremes. Noah watched the scene unfold, his mind working quickly. He could see the cracks in Kane's armor, the fractures in the gang's loyalty. He knew this was his moment to act. "You don't have to follow him," Noah said, addressing the gang. "You've got a choice. You don't have to go down with him." The words hung in the air, their impact rippling through the group. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Jace stepped forward, his expression resolute. "He's right," Jace said. "This isn't worth it, Kane." Rick nodded, stepping up beside Jace. "We're done," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't who we are." Kane's face contorted with rage as he looked at the two men who had once been his most loyal followers. "Cowards," he spat. "All of you." Max hesitated, his heart pounding. He looked at Kane, then at Noah, and finally at Jace and Rick. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward, standing beside Jace and Rick. Kane stared at him, his expression a mix of fury and betrayal. "You too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Max met his gaze, his resolve hardening. "I'm done, Kane. This isn't who I want to be." The remaining gang members looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. One by one, they began to step back, their loyalty to Kane crumbling under the weight of his obsession. Kane was left standing alone, his fists clenched and his chest heaving. "You think this is over," Kane said, his voice shaking with rage. "It's not over." "It can be," Noah said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away, Kane. Let it end." For a moment, it looked like Kane might attack. His entire body was taut with barely contained fury, his eyes blazing with hatred. But then, something in his expression shifted. The fight drained out of him, leaving him looking smaller, defeated. Without a word, Kane turned and walked back to his bike. He climbed on and started the engine, the roar of it breaking the silence. Then, without looking back, he rode off into the night. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Noah let out a quiet breath, his body relaxing slightly. He turned to Max, Jace, and Rick, offering them a small nod. "You did the right thing," he said. Max nodded, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I hope so." Claire stepped out of the gas station, her eyes scanning the scene. "Is it over?" she asked cautiously. "For now," Noah said. "But something tells me this isn't the last we'll see of him." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in shadow, Noah felt a flicker of hope. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. The night sky stretched endlessly above the desert, its stars burning bright against the velvety darkness. For the first time in weeks, the quiet didn't feel threatening to Max. The confrontation with Kane at the gas station was still fresh in his mind, but the overwhelming tension had been replaced by something unfamiliar: hope. Max sat outside the gas station, leaning against the side of a rusted ice chest, a cup of coffee warming his hands. Claire had given it to him without a word, her way of offering support without prying. He stared out at the horizon, his thoughts a tangled mess of relief, fear, and uncertainty. Jace and Rick joined him a moment later, their footsteps soft on the asphalt. Jace sat down next to Max, his hands in his jacket pockets, while Rick leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You look like hell," Jace said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Max huffed a laugh. "Feel like it too." "Worth it, though," Rick said, his voice steady. "We stood up to him. That's no small thing." Max nodded, his chest tightening as he thought about what they'd done. Walking away from Kane had felt impossible, but now that they had, he realized just how heavy the weight of his control had been. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Rick and Jace exchanged a glance, and then Rick spoke. "We start over. Build something real this time. No more running scams or picking fights we can't win. We find a way to make this work." Max frowned, his fingers tapping the side of his coffee cup. "How, though? We're not exactly starting from scratch here. We've got baggage, and a lot of people won't want to deal with that." "True," Jace said, "but that doesn't mean we can't try. There's got to be something we're good at." Max hesitated, then looked at them both. What about a garage? Jace raised an eyebrow. A garage? Yeah, Max said, warming to the idea. We've all worked on bikes and cars. Kane's crew was half mechanics anyway. Maybe we can turn that into something legit. Rick considered this, then nodded. It's not a bad idea. Honest work, something we can be proud of. It'll be tough, though. Starting up a shop takes money, and we don't have much. Better than going back to the way things were, Jace said firmly. Let's do it. Later that morning, Noah stood by his truck watching as Max, Rick, and Jace huddled together, sketching plans on a scrap of cardboard. The determination on their faces was unmistakable, and it brought a faint smile to his lips. He approached them, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. You three look like you've got something cooking, he said. Max looked up, his expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. We're thinking about starting a garage, he said. Something honest. Noah nodded, his respect for them growing. Good idea, but you're going to need more than enthusiasm to pull it off. We know, Rick said. It's a long shot, but we're willing to put in the work. Noah pulled a small notepad from his pocket and scribbled something on it. He handed the paper to Max. This is a contact of mine. He runs a program that helps people like you get back on your feet. Veterans, folks looking for a second chance. He might be able to help you get started. Max took the paper, his throat tightening. Thanks, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. For everything. Don't thank me yet, Noah said with a faint smile. You've got a long road ahead. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With the help of Noah's contact, the group secured a rundown building on the edge of town, a former auto repair shop that had been abandoned for years. Its walls were covered in peeling paint and its roof needed patching, but it had potential. The work was grueling. They spent their days scrubbing grease-stained floors, repairing broken equipment, and repainting the exterior. At night, they pored over budgets, trying to stretch their limited funds as far as possible. It wasn't easy, but the sense of purpose kept them going. Noah helped when he could, offering advice and lending a hand with the heavy lifting. But he kept his distance emotionally, knowing that this was their journey, not his. He had his own demons to face. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Max approached Noah outside the shop. You ever think about what's next for you? He asked, his tone tentative. Noah leaned against the tailgate of his truck, his gaze distant. I've been on the road for a long time, he said. Maybe it's time to stop running. Max nodded, his respect for Noah deepening. If you ever need a place to land, you've got one here, he said. Noah's lips quirked into a faint smile. Appreciate that. On the day the garage opened, the air was electric with anticipation. Friends and neighbors trickled in, curious about the new venture. The freshly painted sign above the door read Second Gear Garage, a name chosen to symbolize fresh starts. Noah watched from a distance, his chest tight with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew his time with them was over. They didn't need him anymore, and it was time for him to move on. As the sun set, Noah packed his truck, his movements deliberate. Max found him in the parking lot, his expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. You're leaving? Max asked. Noah nodded. It's time. Max extended a hand, his grip firm. Thank you. For everything. Noah met his gaze, his voice steady. Take care of them. And take care of yourself. With that, Noah climbed into his truck and drove off, the desert stretching out before him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. The hum of machinery and the clatter of tools filled the air at Second Gear Garage. It had been 2 months since the grand opening, and while business wasn't exactly booming, it was steady enough to keep the lights on and the team busy. Max stood near a workbench, a smudge of grease on his cheek as he focused on the carburetor in front of him. Across the garage, Jace and Rick were arguing good-naturedly about the best way to tackle a particularly stubborn engine block. "You've got to use more torque," Rick said, his voice carrying over the noise. "It's not going to budge otherwise." "And you're going to strip the bolt if you're not careful," Jace shot back. "Patience is key." Max smiled to himself as he listened to their banter. The atmosphere in the garage was a far cry from the tense, volatile environment of Kane's crew. Here, there was laughter, camaraderie, and a shared sense of purpose. But as much as things had changed, Max couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he still had a lot to learn about leading this new venture. As the weeks went on, the challenges of running a business began to pile up. Customers were sometimes demanding, and unexpected expenses seemed to pop up at the worst times. The team worked long hours, and while they were all committed to making the garage a success, the stress occasionally led to friction. One afternoon, Max found himself snapping at Jace over a minor mistake. "You can't just leave tools lying around like that," he barked, his frustration bubbling over. "It's dangerous and unprofessional." Jace bristled, his own temper flaring. "I'm not a rookie, Max. I know what I'm doing." The tension between them was palpable, and Rick stepped in before things could escalate further. "All right, enough," he said firmly. "We're all tired, but we're in this together. Let's not turn on each other." Max sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said, his tone softening. "Sorry, Jace. I didn't mean to snap." Jace nodded, his expression still tight but conciliatory. "It's fine. Let's just get back to work." The incident left Max feeling unsettled. He realized that leading a team wasn't just about making decisions or giving orders. It was about setting the tone and fostering trust. If he wanted the garage to thrive, he needed to be better. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Max sat outside the garage, nursing a bottle of water. The day's tension still weighed heavily on him, and he found himself wishing for guidance. Noah's calm, steady presence had been a cornerstone during their transition, and Max missed having him around. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a motorcycle engine. Max looked up to see a familiar figure pulling into the lot. It was Claire, her hair tucked under a helmet as she dismounted with practiced ease. She approached him with a small smile. "Heard you've been keeping busy," Claire said, nodding toward the garage. "Something like that," Max replied, his smile faint. Claire leaned against the wall, her expression thoughtful. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." Max hesitated, then let out a sigh. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this," he admitted. Running a business, it's a lot." Claire studied him for a moment, then said, "You know, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and adapt. People don't follow you because you have all the answers. They follow you because they believe in you." Max frowned, her words hitting closer to home than he'd expected. "What if I let them down?" "Then you own up to it," Claire said simply. "Being a leader doesn't mean you don't make mistakes. It means you take responsibility for them and do better next time." Claire's words stayed with Max over the next few days, and he made a conscious effort to change his approach. He started taking the time to check in with Jace and Rick, asking for their input on decisions and acknowledging their hard work. He also began to let go of his need for control, trusting his team to handle their responsibilities without micromanaging. The changes didn't happen overnight, but slowly the atmosphere in the garage began to shift. The arguments became less frequent, and the camaraderie that had brought them together in the first place grew stronger. Max found himself enjoying the work more, even when it was challenging. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a particularly busy day, Rick clapped Max on the shoulder. "You're doing good, boss," he said with a grin. Max chuckled. "I'm trying." Jace chimed in, a rare smile on his face. "We're not an easy bunch to lead, but you're getting the hang of it." The genuine support from his team filled Max with a sense of pride and gratitude. For the first time, he felt like he was truly stepping into his role as a leader. As the weeks turned into months, Second Gear Garage continued to grow. word of their honesty and skills spread, and more customers began to seek them out. The team faced setbacks and challenges, but they tackled them together, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as Max locked up the garage for the night, he paused to take it all in. The building that had once been a rundown wreck was now a bustling hub of activity. The people who had once been part of Kane's destructive crew were now a family, building something they could be proud of. Max thought of Noah and hoped that, wherever he was, he knew the impact he'd had on their lives. "We'll make you proud," Max murmured, his voice carried away by the night wind. For the first time, Max felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The gas station stood as it always had, worn and weathered, a relic of a bygone era. Its peeling paint and cracked windows seemed to embody the passage of time, but to Claire, it was home. Now, with Kane and his gang no longer a looming threat, the station felt lighter, freer, but it was still just as worn as before. Claire stood outside, hands on her hips, surveying the building with a critical eye. It was time for a change. Time to rebuild. Claire's first step was reaching out to those she had helped over the years. Travelers, truckers, and neighbors had passed through her station, and she had always treated them with kindness, often offering a free coffee or a warm smile during long journeys. It was time to call in a few favors. Max was the first to arrive, his truck loaded with tools and supplies. He hopped out with a grin. "Figured you might need an extra set of hands." "An extra set of hands and a whole lot of supplies," Claire quipped, raising an eyebrow at the pile in the truck bed. "Let's just say I'm paying off a lifetime supply of your coffee," Max replied, pulling out a crowbar. Rick and Jace arrived shortly after, followed by a few locals who had gotten wind of Claire's plans. By midday, the lot buzzed with activity. Some people cleared debris while others inspected the structural repairs that would be needed. Claire watched it all unfold with a mixture of gratitude and determination. Inside the station, Claire spread out a set of hand-drawn plans on the counter. The station would still serve its original purpose as a fuel stop, but she envisioned a small cafe and convenience store that catered to weary travelers. The old, disused garage at the back of the property would become part of the business as well, a partnership with Second Gear Garage, offering basic vehicle repairs and maintenance. "This is ambitious," Jace said, peering at the blueprints, "but it's got potential." Rick nodded. "I like the idea of the garage. Good way to bring in more people." Claire looked at Max. "Think you and the crew can handle it?" Max hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, we've got the skills. It'll take time, but I think we can pull it off." "Good," Claire said firmly, "because I'm counting on you." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Teams worked on different parts of the property, stripping the walls of old, flaking paint and replacing broken windows. Inside, the dusty old shelves were cleared out to make room for the cafe area, while the garage was outfitted with basic equipment donated by some of Rick and Jace's contacts. The work wasn't without its challenges. At one point, a pipe in the restroom burst, sending water spraying across the floor. Rick swore loudly as he scrambled to shut off the main valve, while Max and Jace doubled over with laughter. Another day, a miscommunication about paint colors led to the front of the building being half-painted in a garish orange before Claire caught the mistake. But through the mishaps, there was camaraderie. Every night, the group gathered around a makeshift fire pit behind the station, sharing stories and laughing over the day's chaos. Slowly but surely, the gas station began to transform. A surprise visit. One afternoon, as the team was installing the new cafe counter, a familiar rumble echoed through the lot. Claire looked up to see Noah pulling in on his motorcycle. He parked near the pumps and dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You've been busy," Noah said, his tone light but impressed as he took in the changes. "You could have helped," Claire shot back, crossing her arms with a mock scowl. "Didn't want to cramp your style," Noah replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He spent the rest of the day helping wherever he could, working quietly alongside the team. His presence brought an unexpected sense of calm. a reminder of how far they'd all come since the chaos of Kane's influence. The day of the reopening dawned bright and clear. A crowd gathered in the lot, the station's shiny new sign, Claire's Crossroads, gleaming in the sunlight. The name had been Claire's idea, symbolizing her vision of the station as a meeting place for travelers from all walks of life. The cafe bustled with activity, the smell of fresh coffee and pastries wafting through the air. At the garage, Max, Rick, and Jace worked on their first official repairs, their efficiency a testament to how far they'd come. As Claire moved through the crowd, greeting guests and checking on her staff, she caught sight of Noah standing near the edge of the lot. He gave her a small nod, his expression one of quiet pride. "You did good," he said when she approached. "Couldn't have done it without you," Claire replied honestly. Noah shrugged, his gaze distant. "You had it in you all along. You just needed the chance to show it." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Claire felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The station wasn't just a business anymore. It was a beacon of hope, proof that even in the face of adversity, rebuilding was possible. The horizon stretched endlessly before Kane as he sat on the edge of a rocky outcrop, the desert wind whipping around him. His motorcycle, once a symbol of power and freedom, was parked a few feet away, covered in a thin layer of dust. He hadn't ridden it in days. The rhythmic thrum of the engine, which once calmed his restless mind, now served as a haunting reminder of all he had lost. Since the confrontation at the gas station, Kane had been adrift. He'd spent weeks wandering aimlessly, avoiding towns where he might run into familiar faces. The image of his crew walking away, one by one, played on a loop in his mind. Their betrayal, or what he had seen as betrayal, cut deeper than any wound he'd endured in countless brawls. For years he had led them, and in a single night they had turned their backs on him. Kane's flask clinked softly as he pulled it from his jacket. The burn of whiskey provided fleeting comfort, but it couldn't drown out the memories that crowded his mind. He thought back to the early days, when the gang had been more than just a group of rough bikers looking for trouble. They'd been a family. Together, they had carved out their own place in the world, bound by loyalty and a shared sense of purpose. Somewhere along the line, things had changed. Kane had changed. His pursuit of respect had morphed into an obsession, and the camaraderie that once defined the gang had been replaced by fear. He told himself he was doing what he had to as a leader, but the truth was he had alienated the very people he sought to protect. Now, sitting alone under the vast desert sky, Kane felt the crushing weight of his decisions. The voices of his crew echoed in his mind, Jace's firm challenges, Rick's calm reasoning, and Max's final words before walking away. Each memory was a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Kane started his motorcycle and rode into a small town he'd never been to before. The hum of the engine didn't soothe him as it once had. Instead, it was a constant drone, mirroring the noise in his head. He parked outside a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly against the encroaching twilight. Inside, the air smelled of greasy burgers and stale coffee. Kane slid into a booth near the window, his eyes scanning the room. His breath caught when he spotted a familiar face at the counter. It was Max. Max was chatting with the waitress, a small smile playing on his lips as he gestured to a takeout bag. He looked different, lighter, happier. The tight lines of stress that once marked his face were gone, replaced by an ease Kane couldn't remember seeing before. Max turned, and their eyes met briefly. For a moment, neither moved. Then Max's expression hardened and he walked over to Kane's booth. "Kane," Max said, his tone cautious, "didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to be here," Kane replied, his voice rough. Max set the takeout bag on the table, crossing his arms. "You all right?" Kane let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look all right?" Max didn't answer. Instead, he sat across from Kane, his gaze steady. "Why are you here?" Kane hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Maybe I just needed to see for myself." "See what?" "That you're okay," Kane said, his voice quiet. "That you're better off." Max studied him, his expression unreadable. "We are," he said after a long pause. "Better than we've been in a long time." Kane nodded, swallowing hard. "Good, I'm glad." Their conversation was interrupted by the waitress bringing Kane a cup of coffee and a plate of food. Max rose to leave, but before he walked away, he turned back to Kane. "You could do better," Max said simply. Kane frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't have to keep doing this," Max said. "You don't have to be this person. It's not too late to change." Kane scoffed. "Change into what? A guy who works at a garage? Not sure that's in the cards for me." Max didn't argue. Instead, he said, "It's your call. But if you want things to be different, it starts with you." With that, Max left the diner, leaving Kane alone with his thoughts. The younger man's words echoed in his mind, stirring something he hadn't felt in years. The faintest flicker of hope. As Kane rode back to the desert that night, the stars overhead seemed impossibly distant. He parked his bike on the side of a quiet road and sat on the ground, leaning back against the tires. The weight of his regrets pressed down on him, and for the first time, he let himself feel it fully. He thought of the people he had hurt, the friendships he had destroyed, and the family he had lost. The man he had become wasn't the man he wanted to be. For years, he had convinced himself that strength meant never admitting weakness. But now, he wondered if strength was something else entirely. Maybe Max was right. Maybe it wasn't too late. Kane closed his eyes, the desert wind whispering softly around him. Change wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. The morning sun bathed the newly renovated second-gear garage in golden light, its fresh coat of paint gleaming as Max unlocked the doors. Inside, the space buzzed with activity. Jace and Rick were already at work, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic clank of tools and the low hum of an air compressor. The garage had come a long way, transforming from a desperate idea into a thriving business. Max walked to the counter as the bell over the door chimed. A customer entered, a man in his mid-30s, wearing a grease-stained baseball cap. He looked around, his expression curious but hopeful. "Morning," Max greeted, wiping his hands on a rag. "What can we do for you?" The man hesitated, then replied, "Heard you guys do good work. Got a truck that's been acting up." "You came to the right place," Max said with an easy smile. "Let's take a look." The garage wasn't just a workplace. It had become a sanctuary for everyone involved. Jace, who had once been a hardened enforcer in Kane's gang, now prided himself on his precision and efficiency. Rick, always the steady problem solver, had grown into the role of mentor for the younger team members. Max, once unsure of his own leadership abilities, had fully embraced the responsibility of guiding the crew. Even the newer members, like Sam, were finding their footing. Sam had been one of the gang's younger recruits, full of energy but directionless. Under Rick's patient guidance, he was blossoming into a skilled mechanic, eager to prove himself. The team wasn't just fixing cars, they were rebuilding their lives. One afternoon, the familiar rumble of a motorcycle echoed into the garage lot. The team froze, exchanging uncertain glances. Max wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside, his heart pounding as he saw Kane dismounting his bike. Kane looked different. His leather jacket was weathered, his posture less imposing, but his expression was unreadable, a mix of determination and vulnerability. He raised a hand in greeting, his voice subdued. "Max." Max's shoulders tensed. "Kane, didn't expect to see you here." Kane nodded, his eyes scanning the garage. "Didn't think I'd come back, but I needed to." Max's voice hardened. "Why?" Kane took a deep breath, meeting Max's gaze. "I messed up, with all of you. I've been thinking about everything. How I led, how I treated people, and I know I can't undo it. But I want to try to make it right." The sincerity in Kane's voice gave Max pause. He studied the man who had once ruled their gang with an iron fist and saw something unexpected. Regret. "Come inside," Max said finally. The garage fell silent as Kane stepped inside. Jace and Rick stopped working, their tools forgotten as they watched him warily. Kane raised his hand slightly, his movements unthreatening. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," Kane began, his voice steady but humble. "But I'm not here to cause trouble. I came to say I'm sorry, for everything. I let my pride get in the way, and I dragged all of you down with me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I had to say it." Rick crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "Why now?" "Because I've seen what I lost," Kane said simply, "and I don't want to lose the chance to make things right." Jace stepped forward, his jaw tight. "We've moved on, Kane. We don't need you." "I know," Kane replied, his voice firm but not defensive. "But if there's any way I can help, I'm here. I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm asking for a chance to do better." The tension in the room was palpable, but Max broke the silence. "All right," he said. "If you're serious about changing, then you can start by helping out." Kane blinked, surprised. "You'd let me?" "On one condition," Max said. "You don't call the shots. You take direction like everyone else." Kane nodded without hesitation. "Deal." Kane's return wasn't easy. The old wounds he had caused didn't heal overnight, and his presence reopened some of the crew's deepest insecurities. But Kane approached the work with humility, tackling the dirtiest, most thankless tasks without complaint. Slowly, his efforts began to earn him a measure of trust. One evening, as the team wrapped up for the day, they gathered outside the garage, beers in hand. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, orange glow across the lot. Kane sat apart from the group at first, but Rick motioned for him to join them. As the laughter and conversation flowed, Kane felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. It wasn't the same as before. It was better. He wasn't leading this group anymore, but he was a part of it, and that was enough. Months passed, and the garage thrived. Customers came not just for the quality repairs, but for the sense of community that radiated from the team. Max, Rick, Jace, and even Kane had found a new rhythm, one built on mutual respect and shared goals. Kane found his place among them, not as a leader, but as a member of the family they had created. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but for the first time, they faced it together. The desert wind carried a faint chill as Noah parked his motorcycle outside Claire's Crossroads. The newly refurbished gas station was a beacon of warmth against the growing dusk, its glowing lights and fresh paint a testament to the hard work poured into it. Noah hadn't visited in weeks, choosing to give the team space to settle into their new normal. But something about tonight had called him back. Inside, the cafe was bustling. Travelers laughed and talked, mugs of coffee steaming in their hands. Claire worked behind the counter, pouring drinks and sliding plates of food to her customers. When she spotted Noah, her face broke into a grin. "Well, look who decided to show up," she teased, walking over. "Here for the grand tour, or are you just hungry?" "Maybe a bit of both," Noah said, his tone warm. "Place looks good." "Better than good," Claire said with pride. "Go grab a seat. I'll bring you something." Noah chose a corner booth where he could watch the room. The cafe was lively, full of people sharing stories and exchanging smiles. It was a far cry from the tense, fractured atmosphere that had once surrounded the station. Max spotted him and made his way over, pulling out a chair. "Noah," he said, his tone light. "Didn't think we'd see you again." "Didn't think I'd be back," Noah admitted. "But here I am." Max studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "What brings you by?" Noah shrugged. "Just wanted to check in, see how things are going." Max smiled faintly. "Better than we ever thought they could. The garage is steady. Claire's got this place running like clockwork. Things are good." "You sound surprised," Noah said, a teasing edge to his voice. "Guess I am," Max admitted. "Never thought I'd end up here, doing this." As they talked, Claire brought over 2 steaming mugs and a plate of sandwiches, sliding them onto the table. "Figured you two could use this," she said with a wink before heading back to the counter. Max took a sip of his coffee, his brow furrowing. "You ever think about why you do this?" he asked suddenly. Noah tilted his head. "Why I do what?" "Help people like us," Max said. "You could have just walked away after the gas station, could have kept going. But you didn't." Noah leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about helping people. Not entirely. It's about choices. In the military, every choice you make has a consequence. Some are good, some are bad, but they all lead somewhere. When I met you, you were at a crossroads. I saw a chance to nudge you in the right direction." Max nodded slowly. "And what about you? What drives you?" Noah's gaze drifted to the window, his voice softening. "Redemption, I guess. I've made choices I'm not proud of. Lost people because of them. Helping you and the others. It's my way of balancing the scales. Doesn't fix the past, but it helps me move forward." Max studied him, his respect for Noah deepening. "You make it sound like you've got it all figured out." Noah chuckled. "Far from it. Every day's a learning curve. Leadership, especially. It's not about being perfect. It's about being accountable, owning your mistakes, learning from them, and earning the trust of the people who follow you." Max's expression turned pensive. "It's not always easy. Sometimes I feel like I'm making it up as I go." "That's because you are," Noah said with a grin. "And that's okay. No one has all the answers. The fact that you care enough to try, that's what matters." Max let out a soft laugh. "You're starting to sound like Claire." "She's got a good head on her shoulders," Noah said. "You should listen to her." As the conversation shifted, Noah began sharing stories from his military days. Some were harrowing, tales of near misses and tough calls in the field. Others were light-hearted, moments of camaraderie and humor that had kept him going in the darkest times. Max listened intently, drawn to the wisdom woven through Noah's words. It wasn't just about surviving hardship. It was about finding purpose in it, about holding on to the things that made life worth living. "You ever think about settling down?" Max asked after a pause. Noah raised an eyebrow. "Not really my style." "Maybe it should be," Max said. "You've been on the road long enough. Maybe it's time to take a break." Noah didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the space between them. "Maybe," he said finally, "but not yet." As the evening wound down, Noah stood, leaving enough cash on the table to cover the meal and then some. Max walked him to the door, the cool night air wrapping around them. "Thanks for stopping by," Max said, extending a hand. Noah shook it firmly. "You're doing good work, Max. Don't forget that." Max nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "I won't." Noah climbed onto his motorcycle, the engine roaring to life. He glanced back at the station one last time, a faint smile playing on his lips. Then, with a final nod, he rode off into the night, his silhouette disappearing into the horizon. Max watched him go, his mind racing with the lessons Noah had imparted. Leadership, trust, accountability. It was all starting to make sense. For the first time, Max felt like he truly understood what it meant to lead, not just a team, but himself. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the garage lot as Kane tightened the last bolt on a truck engine. His hands moved methodically, the mechanical work providing a rare moment of clarity. Over the past few months, he had worked tirelessly to earn the crew's trust, taking on the toughest jobs without complaint. Yet, despite his efforts, a lingering doubt remained. Could he truly escape the shadow of his past? "Looks good," Jace said, approaching with a nod toward the truck. "You've been knocking out jobs like a machine." "Just doing my part," Kane replied, his voice steady. Jace leaned against the workbench, studying him. "You've been quiet lately." Kane shrugged, avoiding Jace's gaze. "Focused, that's all." "Focused is good," Jace said. "But don't forget we're a team now. You don't have to do everything alone." Kane glanced at Jace, appreciating the words more than he could express. Old habits died hard, and relying on others still felt foreign. But in this new chapter of his life, he was learning, slowly, to trust. The day passed uneventfully until late afternoon, when the distant roar of a motorcycle broke the calm. Kane's stomach tightened as the rider pulled into the lot. He recognized the man immediately. Troy, an old associate from his gang's darker days. The man dismounted, his smirk as sharp as ever. "Well, look at you," Troy drawled, taking in the sight of the garage. "Didn't think I'd find Kane the Terrible playing house." Kane's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Troy?" "Relax," Troy said, raising his hands. "I'm just here to talk. Got a job you might be interested in. Big payout, easy money, just like old times." Kane crossed his arms. "Not interested." Troy's smirk faltered. "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to," Kane said firmly. "Old times are over." For a moment, Troy's expression darkened, but he quickly recovered, his grin returning. "Fair enough," he said, turning to leave. "But don't think this is the last you'll see of me. Some people don't forget." Kane shared the encounter with the crew that evening. They listened in silence as he recounted Troy's words, their expressions growing grim. "Do you think he'll come back?" Rick asked. "I'd bet on it," Kane replied. Max frowned, crossing his arms. "If he does, we'll deal with him. Together." Kane hesitated, the weight of their support hitting him hard. He wasn't used to relying on others, but the unwavering trust in Max's voice was undeniable. "Thanks," he said quietly. "We've got your back," Jace said. "Just don't give us a reason to regret it." Kane nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. 2 days later, Troy returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 other bikers flanked him, their presence exuding quiet menace. The garage fell silent as the crew stopped what they were doing to watch the intruders. Kane stepped forward, his posture calm but firm. "What do you want, Troy?" "Same thing I wanted last time," Troy said, dismounting. "Your help." "And like I said before," Kane replied, his voice steady, "I'm not interested." Troy's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You sure about that? I'd hate for your new friends here to pay the price for your decision." The thinly veiled threat sent a ripple of tension through the crew. Max stepped forward, his voice steady. "You need to leave. Now." Troy turned to Max, his smirk returning. "You've got guts, kid, but I'm not leaving until I get what I came for." Rick and Jace moved to flank Max, their stances unyielding. The crew's unity was palpable, and Troy seemed to sense it. He took a step back, his grin hardening. "All right," he said. "We'll go, but don't think this is over." As Troy and his gang rode off, the crew let out a collective breath. The tension lingered, but the threat had passed, at least for now. Later that evening, as the crew cleaned up for the day, Kane pulled Max aside. "You didn't have to stand up for me like that," he said. "Yes, we did," Max replied without hesitation. "We're a team. That means we stand together." Kane's chest tightened at the words. For so long he had relied on fear and control to keep people close. But here, in this small garage, he had found something far more meaningful. Trust. "Thanks," Kane said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Max clapped him on the shoulder. "I know." The encounter with Troy marked a turning point for Kane. He threw himself into his work with renewed determination, proving himself not just through his words, but through his actions. Slowly but surely, the crew's initial wariness gave way to genuine trust. As the weeks passed, the garage continued to thrive. Customers came not just for the quality repairs, but for the sense of community that radiated from the team. Kane found his place among them, not as a leader, but as an equal. For the first time in years, Kane felt like he belonged, and this time, he wasn't about to let it slip away. The crisp morning air carried a faint chill as Noah parked his motorcycle outside the garage for what he knew would be the last time. The past few months had been a whirlwind, watching the team grow, seeing Max step into his role as a leader, and witnessing Kane's slow but steady transformation. But now, with the garage thriving and the team standing strong, Noah knew his role in their story was complete. Inside, the familiar hum of activity greeted him. Max was discussing schedules with Rick while Jace worked on a classic car in the corner. Claire leaned against the counter, her arms crossed as she watched the team with a faint smile. When Noah stepped through the door, heads turned. Claire's smile widened, but there was something knowing in her expression. She walked over, tilting her head. "Didn't think we'd see you again." "Figured I'd stop by," Noah replied, his tone calm. "One last time." The team gathered around the counter, their laughter and chatter quieting as Noah took a seat. Max leaned against the counter, his brow furrowing. "One last time? What's that supposed to mean?" Noah met Max's gaze, his expression steady. "It means you don't need me anymore. You've got this." Jace frowned. "Come on, Noah. We wouldn't even be here without you." "That's not true," Noah said firmly. "I gave you a push, but everything you've built, you did that yourselves, and now it's time for me to move on." The room fell silent, the weight of Noah's words settling over them. Claire broke the tension, her voice soft but teasing. "You always did have a flair for dramatic exits." Noah chuckled, just trying to keep things interesting. After a few minutes, Max motioned for Noah to step outside. The two men walked out into the lot, the sun just beginning to crest over the horizon. Max crossed his arms, his expression conflicted. "So, that's it?" Max asked. "You're just going to ride off into the sunset?" "That's the plan," Noah said. "You don't need me hanging around, Max. You're doing a damn good job on your own." Max shook his head. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." Noah placed a hand on Max's shoulder, his grip firm. "You're ready. You've proven that 100 times over. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to face the challenges and keep going. And you've done that." Max swallowed hard, his throat tightening. I don't want to screw this up." "You won't," Noah said simply. "Because you care. That's what makes you different." Back inside, the rest of the team was waiting. Jace and Rick stood side by side, their postures relaxed but their expressions tinged with sadness. Claire leaned against the counter, her usual wit replaced by quiet understanding. "You really leaving?" Jace asked. "Yeah," Noah said. "It's time." Rick stepped forward, extending a hand. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." Noah shook Rick's hand, then Jace's. "You're a good team," he said. "Keep looking out for each other." Yet, when it was Claire's turn, she didn't bother with a handshake. Instead, she pulled Noah into a brief hug. "Take care of yourself," she said, "and don't be a stranger." Noah smiled. No promises. As Noah strapped on his helmet and climbed onto his motorcycle, the team gathered in the lot to see him off. Max stepped forward one last time, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Where are you headed?" "Wherever the road takes me," Noah said with a faint smile. "That's the beauty of it." The engine roared to life, the sound breaking the stillness of the morning. Noah gave them a final nod, his gaze lingering on the group for a moment longer. Then he shifted into gear and pulled away, the desert road stretching out before him. As the garage grew smaller in the rearview mirror, Noah felt a mixture of sadness and peace. He had left a part of himself behind, but he knew it was in good hands. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. He was moving forward. Back at the garage, the team stood in silence, watching until Noah was out of sight. Max let out a slow breath, his chest tight but his resolve firm. "All right," he said, turning to the others. "Let's get to work." The team nodded, their sadness tempered by a sense of purpose. They had come so far, and they weren't about to stop now. The hum of machinery and the rhythmic clink of tools filled the air at Second Gear Garage. It was a typical day, yet the absence of Noah lingered in the hearts of the crew. Though he had departed weeks ago, the lessons he left behind were etched into their daily routines. Max, now fully settled into his role as the team's leader, carried on the philosophy that Noah had instilled: accountability, trust, and a willingness to grow. Jace was working with Sam, explaining the finer points of carburetor adjustment with a surprising amount of patience. Rick moved between workstations, offering quiet guidance and ensuring that nothing slipped through the cracks. The once fractured group had become a seamless unit, each member finding their place within the larger whole. Max stepped out into the lot, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. His gaze drifted to the road, a habit he hadn't quite broken since Noah's departure. Part of him still expected to see the familiar silhouette of the soldier's motorcycle cresting the horizon, but the road remained empty. As word of the garage's success spread, its reputation began to draw customers from neighboring towns and travelers passing through. But it wasn't just the quality of the repairs that brought them, it was the atmosphere. There was something intangible about the place, an unspoken sense of community and authenticity that made people want to come back. One afternoon, an older man arrived in a rusted pickup truck, his cowboy hat tilted against the sun. "You, the folks who've been turning this place around?" he asked, tipping his hat. "That's us," Max said, extending a hand. "What can we do for you?" The man smiled, his weathered face creasing. "Heard you're good people. My truck's seen better days. Thought I'd bring it to someone I can trust." The word trust struck Max deeply. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a validation of everything they had worked toward. He turned to Rick, nodding toward the truck. "Let's take care of him." The garage wasn't the only place thriving. Claire's Crossroads had become a hub for the community, its cafe drawing both locals and travelers. The partnership between the garage and the station was symbiotic, each benefiting from the other's success. Travelers who stopped for gas often found themselves heading to the garage for a quick repair or advice, and vice versa. Claire made a point of visiting the garage regularly, bringing coffee and snacks for the crew. On one such visit, she handed Max a steaming cup and gave him a knowing look. "You've got a good thing going here," she said. Max chuckled. "We're trying." "You're doing more than trying," Claire replied. "You're building something real. Don't forget to enjoy it." One evening, as the team was wrapping up for the day, the rumble of a motorcycle broke the quiet. Max's heart leapt, but as the rider pulled into the lot, he realized it wasn't Noah. It was Kane. Kane dismounted, his expression cautious but hopeful. He had changed in subtle ways. His posture was less defensive, his eyes no longer carrying the same sharp edge. "Thought I'd stop by," Kane said, his voice steady. "See how things are going." Rick crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Things are good." Kane nodded, his gaze sweeping across the garage. "Looks like it." There was a pause before Jace stepped forward, extending a hand. "Good to see you, Kane." The handshake was brief but significant, a gesture of acceptance that spoke louder than words. Kane smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. As the weeks turned into months, the garage's influence reached far beyond its walls. The team had become more than co-workers. They were a family, bound by the shared experience of rebuilding their lives. They carried Noah's lessons with them, his words shaping their actions and decisions. Max often thought of Noah, wondering where he was and what roads he traveled, but he didn't dwell on it. Noah had given them everything they needed. and now it was their turn to carry the torch. One evening, as the crew gathered outside the garage, Max looked around at the faces of his team. Jace was telling a story that had everyone laughing, while Rick and Kane discussed plans for expanding the garage. Claire leaned against the hood of a car, her smile soft as she watched the scene unfold. "This is what it's all about," Max said quietly. Claire glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "What's that?" "Building something that lasts," Max replied. "Something that makes people better." Claire nodded, her gaze returning to the group. "You've done that, Max. All of you have." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lot in hues of orange and gold, Max felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. They had weathered storms, faced their demons, and come out stronger on the other side. And though Noah was gone, his philosophy remained, woven into the fabric of everything they did. Choices had consequences, but they also had the power to shape futures. The garage, the gas station, the people, they were all proof of that. Max raised a hand, calling for the group's attention. "All right, enough standing around," he said with a grin. "Let's get back to work." The laughter and groans that followed were filled with warmth, a reflection of the bond they had forged. Together they turned toward the future, ready for whatever came next. The desert stretched into the horizon, its vastness bathed in the golden hues of dawn. At Second Gear Garage, the hum of life had begun early. The clang of tools, the faint murmur of voices, and the occasional laugh created a symphony of purpose. The team had found their rhythm, a balance of hard work and camaraderie that spoke volumes about how far they had come. Max stood outside, sipping a cup of coffee as the cool morning air kissed his face. He glanced at the road, a habit he hadn't quite broken since Noah's departure. Though the soldier was gone, his presence lingered, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Inside, Rick and Jace were already hard at work, their banter light-hearted as they tackled the day's first repair. Kane was at the counter, reviewing the schedule with a focus that had become second nature. Even Sam, once the uncertain rookie, moved with confidence, his hands deftly sorting tools for the upcoming jobs. For Max, it was a moment of quiet reflection. They had built something remarkable, not just a successful garage, but a community. As the day progressed, the steady flow of customers reaffirmed the garage's growing reputation. Travelers and locals alike came not just for repairs, but for the atmosphere, a sense of honesty and trust that made the garage more than just a business. One customer, an elderly woman with a beaming smile, handed Max a tin of homemade cookies as she waited for her car to be serviced. "You've got a good thing here," she said. "It's rare these days, finding people who genuinely care." Max smiled, her words stirring a deep sense of pride. "Thank you. We're just trying to do right by folks." "And you're succeeding," she replied, her eyes twinkling. Moments like these reminded Max of Noah's philosophy, that every choice mattered, and that even small acts of integrity could create ripples far beyond their origin. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lot, the team gathered outside. It had become a tradition of sorts, ending the day together, sharing stories and laughter under the vast desert sky. Claire joined them, carrying a tray of iced tea. She set it down on the hood of a car, her gaze sweeping over the group. "You know," she said, her tone thoughtful, "this place has become something special." Max nodded, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "It has, and it's because of all of you." Jace snorted, though his expression was warm. "Don't get all sentimental on us, Max." "Too late," Rick said with a grin. "He's already started." The group laughed, the sound carrying into the night. Kane, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "It's true, though. This place, it changes people." Max looked at him, surprised but grateful for the sentiment. "And we've all changed with it," he said, "including me." As the stars began to dot the darkening sky, Max stood, holding his glass of iced tea. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said, drawing the group's attention. "About Noah and what he left us." The mention of Noah brought a hush over the group, but it wasn't heavy with sadness. Instead, it was filled with respect and gratitude. "Noah talked a lot about choices," Max continued, "about how they shape us and the people around us. He didn't just teach us how to fix things. He taught us how to rebuild, how to grow." Rick nodded, his expression solemn. "It's not about getting everything right. It's about owning what you do and making it count." "That's the real lesson," Max said, his voice steady. "It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, every day, to be better." The group raised their glasses in a quiet toast, their voices overlapping. "To Noah," they said in unison, "and to what he left behind." As the night deepened, the group lingered, their bond stronger than ever. They had come a long way, but the journey wasn't over. There would be new challenges, new roads to navigate, but they would face them together, carrying the lessons they had learned and the legacy they had built. Max gazed up at the stars, his heart full. He didn't know where Noah was or if he'd ever return, but one thing was certain: the soldiers' philosophy would live on, guiding them as they continued to grow. For Max, for the team, and for the community they had created, the road ahead was full of promise, and this time they were ready for it.